Perhaps you have, somewhere in a drawer or filing cabinet, a share certificate. Maybe it's from a company where you once worked, or an investment made years ago, the paper now slightly yellowed, the ink faded but still readable. If you were to hold it up to the light and look closely, really look, you would see something remarkable. There, on that rectangle of paper, is a claim to ownership. A fraction of a company, a slice of enterprise, yours to hold or sell as you wish. These certificates, descendants of documents created 4 centuries ago, connect you to a long, quiet story of merchants and markets, of capital and commerce, of the slow transformation of how human beings organize their economic lives. Tonight we'll explore the gentle history of the world's first mega corporation, the Dutch East India Company, known to history as the VOC. We'll walk through Amsterdam's counting houses, sail aboard ships heavy with spices, and watch as merchants gathered to trade pieces of paper that represented ownership in something vast and distant. There's no need to concentrate on dates or numbers. Let the story wash over you like water moving through canals. Settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow your mind to drift as we explore the sleepy history of the company that invented the modern corporation. Before there was a company, before anyone imagined a business that would last for centuries, before shares could be bought and sold like fruit in a market, there was simply trade. Small groups of merchants pooling their resources, sending ships eastward toward the Spice Islands, hoping those ships would return. The world in the late 1500s was one of patient calculation, of risks carefully measured, of capital committed for years at a time with no guarantee of return. Picture Amsterdam in 1595, a city of narrow houses and quieter canals than it would later know. The Spanish and Portuguese controlled the spice trade, their ships sailing to the East Indies and returning with holds full of pepper and nutmeg, cinnamon and cloves. These spices, grown on distant islands, commanded extraordinary prices in European markets. A single successful voyage could make a merchant wealthy. But the Portuguese guarded their routes jealously, and European merchants who wanted spices had to buy them in Lisbon, paying whatever prices the Portuguese demanded. The Dutch, meanwhile, were fighting for their independence from Spain, a long struggle that had been going on for decades and would continue for decades more. This conflict, while disruptive, also created a certain entrepreneurial energy. Dutch merchants, unable to buy spices in Lisbon once Spain controlled Portugal, began to consider a radical alternative. What if they could sail to the East Indies themselves? What if they could bypass the Portuguese entirely, trading directly with the people who grew the spices? The first Dutch voyage to the East Indies departed in 1595, led by a merchant named Cornelis de Houtman. 4 ships sailed from the port of Texel, their holds filled with trade goods, their crews uncertain what they would find. The journey took more than 2 years. Ships rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, crossed the Indian Ocean, reached the islands of Java and Sumatra. The men aboard dealt with storms and disease, with heat and the endless horizon. When they finally returned to Amsterdam in 1597, only 3 of the 4 ships came back, and many of the crew had died. But the ships brought spices, and those spices, even after all the costs, generated profit. This success, modest though it was, caught attention. If one group of merchants could sail to the Indies and return with profit, others could too, and so they did. In the years that followed, multiple small companies formed in different Dutch cities. Each was a voorcompagnie, A pre-company, a temporary partnership created for a single voyage or series of voyages. Merchants would pool their capital, purchase ships, hire crews, and send their vessels eastward. When the ships returned, the cargo would be sold, profits calculated, and the partnership would dissolve. Investors received their initial capital back plus their share of the profits, and the company ceased to exist. This system had a certain logic to it. Risk was limited to individual voyages. If a ship was lost, investors in that particular venture lost their money, but other voyages were unaffected. The partnerships were flexible, forming and dissolving as opportunities arose. But the system also had significant limitations. Capital was locked up for years at a time. A merchant who invested in a voyage departing in 1600 might not see any return until 1602 or even 1603. During that time, his money was tied up, unavailable for other opportunities, generating no income, existing only as a hope that distant ships would return safely. Imagine a merchant's office in Amsterdam, sometime around 1600. The room is narrow, as Amsterdam houses are, with high windows letting in the northern light. A desk stands against one wall, its surface covered with papers, letters from correspondents in other cities, manifests listing cargo, contracts specifying terms of partnership, ledger books, their pages covered with neat columns of figures, record investments made, obligations owed, profits anticipated. The merchant sits at this desk, a quill in his hand, calculating. He has invested in 3 separate voyages. One departed 8 months ago and won't return for at least another year, probably longer. A second has been gone for nearly 2 years now, and he expects to hear news of its return any month. The third voyage had been a disaster. The ships lost in a storm off Madagascar, all capital gone, nothing recovered. Such losses were part of the business, factored into calculations, absorbed by spreading investments across multiple ventures. But still, the waiting weighed heavily. Years of capital locked into ships that might never return, hopes pinned on the competence of captains he would never meet, on weather patterns he couldn't control, on trading conditions in ports he'd never seen. The waiting created its own rhythm. Spring came and ships departed. Months passed. A year went by. Then another. Occasionally news arrived, brought by other vessels, fragments of information about ships sighted or heard of. Then, if fortune favoured, the ships returned. The crew gaunt from their journey, the cargo carefully inventoried, the goods taken to warehouses where they would be sorted and eventually auctioned. Pepper from Malabar, nutmeg and mace from the Banda Islands, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas. Each spice had travelled thousands of miles, passed through multiple hands, accumulated value with each stage of its journey. The economics were compelling when voyages succeeded. A pound of pepper that cost almost nothing in Indonesia might sell for 60 times that amount in Amsterdam. Nutmeg was even more profitable, its price difference between origin and destination almost absurd. The margin seemed infinite, the opportunities boundless, and yet the reality was more complicated. Not every voyage succeeded. Ships sank, crews died, cargoes rotted. Even successful voyages faced uncertainties. By the time Dutch ships reached the Indies, prices there might have risen because multiple Dutch companies had arrived simultaneously, all competing to buy the same spices from the same suppliers. The Dutch companies were bidding against each other, driving up the prices they paid, reducing the profits they could make in Amsterdam. This competition troubled the merchants. They were Dutch patriots, united in their struggle against Spain, and yet they competed fiercely with each other in Asian markets. A merchant in Amsterdam might find himself paying inflated prices for nutmeg because another merchant from Rotterdam had arrived first and bought up the available supply. Or worse, the local suppliers, understanding that multiple Dutch buyers would soon arrive, might hold their crops, waiting for prices to rise. The voorcompagnieën, for all their entrepreneurial energy, were undermining each other's profitability. The Spanish, too, posed a continuing threat. Spain claimed authority over the Portuguese Empire, which included trading posts throughout Asia. Spanish ships sometimes attacked Dutch vessels. The Dutch ships sailed armed, carrying cannon and soldiers, prepared to fight if necessary. This military preparedness added to costs. The ships needed to be larger, more heavily built, to carry both cargo and weapons. The crews needed to include soldiers as well as sailors, all requiring wages and provisions. The line between merchant vessel and warship blurred, each ship prepared for both commerce and combat. Some voorcompagnieën lasted longer than others, operating multiple voyages before dissolving. The Oude Compagnie, the Old Company, based in Amsterdam, had been particularly active, sending out numerous expeditions. The New Compagnie, the New Company, also from Amsterdam, competed with it. In Rotterdam, Middelburg, Delft, Hoorn, other small companies formed, sent ships, distributed profits, and reformed for new voyages. The organisational innovation had not yet occurred to anyone. This was simply how trade worked, the pattern inherited from earlier generations, modified slightly for the particular demands of Eastern voyages. In the counting houses and coffee houses where merchants gathered, conversations turned increasingly to the problem of coordination. Some suggested that cooperation might serve everyone better than competition. If the various companies merged, if they agreed to divide the Asian markets among themselves rather than competing, if they pooled their military resources and presented a united front against Spanish and Portuguese rivals, everyone might profit more. The idea was appealing in theory, but in practice it faced obstacles. Merchants from different cities were rivals, jealous of their prerogatives, suspicious of each other's motives. The voorcompagnieën were based in separate cities, each with its own commercial traditions, its own networks of investors, its own civic pride. And yet, the conversation continued, quietly, persistently. Letters were written, meetings held, proposals discussed. The States General, the governing body of the Dutch Republic, took an interest. A unified Dutch trading company might serve political purposes as well as commercial ones. It could be an instrument of statecraft, projecting Dutch power into Asia, countering Spanish influence, establishing Dutch presence in regions far from Europe. The economic arguments for cooperation merged with political considerations, creating momentum for something unprecedented. The merchants tallied their ledgers, calculated their costs, projected their profits. The numbers suggested that cooperation would indeed be profitable, that the savings from eliminating mutual competition would exceed any disadvantages of merger. Individual ambition began to bend toward collective interest. Slowly, the way merchants always moved, carefully, with attention to detail, with contracts specifying terms and conditions. The groundwork was being laid, though no one could yet see exactly what structure would emerge from these negotiations. In warehouses along Amsterdam's waterfront, spices were stored, waiting for auction. sacks of pepper piled high, barrels of cloves, their scent filling the air, nutmeg in smaller quantities, more valuable, kept under careful watch. The physical reality of trade surrounded everything, the actual goods that justified all the calculation and risk, the tangible products that would be sold to make the whole enterprise worthwhile. The spices had travelled so far, passed through so many hands, that their journey itself seemed improbable, and yet here they were, waiting to be sold, to generate the profits that would reward investors, justify the risks, and fund future voyages. The years passed, 1600 into 1601, and the conversations about merger continued. The details were complex. How would capital be divided? Which city's chamber would control what? How would the profits be distributed? Who would serve on the board of directors? Each question required negotiation, compromise, careful drafting of terms that all parties could accept. The merchants were patient, accustomed to waiting years for ships to return. They could wait months for negotiations to conclude, as long as the outcome promised lasting benefit. And if this patient world of trade and calculation, of ledgers and waiting, of ships sailing and merchants negotiating, an idea was forming. Not a dramatic idea, not a revolutionary concept announced with fanfare, but a quiet recognition that there might be a different way to organize commerce. That capital, instead of forming and dissolving with each voyage, might be made permanent, that a company might continue indefinitely, its ships always at sea, its operations never ceasing. That ownership in such a company might be divided into shares that could be bought and sold, allowing investors to enter and exit without disrupting the company's operations. The idea was taking shape in conversations and letters, in draft proposals and amended contracts. It was emerging from the collective experience of merchants who had lived with the voorcompagnieën system and recognized its limitations. No single person invented it. No moment of genius created it. Rather, it grew organically from the needs of trade, from the logic of the situation, from the recognition that something better was possible. And as 1601 gave way to 1602, that idea was about to take physical form, to be written into a charter, to become the structure through which Dutch merchants would organize their Eastern trade for the next 2 centuries. The charter was granted on March 20th, 1602. The States General of the United Provinces, meeting in The Hague, approved the formation of the United East India Company, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, known ever after by its initials, VOC. The document was formal, written in the elaborate legal language of the time, but its practical effect was simple. 6 separate voorcompagnieën, those temporary partnerships that had been competing with each other, would merge into a single entity. This new company would hold a monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. No other Dutch merchant could trade in those regions without the company's permission. The monopoly would last for 21 years, after which it might be renewed. This much was conventional. Monopolies were common, granted by governments to favoured merchants or companies in exchange for various services or payments. What made the VOC Charter revolutionary was not the monopoly itself, but the structure underneath it. The company would not dissolve after each voyage. It would be permanent, a going concern that would continue indefinitely. Investors would not receive their capital back when ships returned. Instead, their capital would remain in the company, funding ongoing operations, available for the directors to deploy as they saw fit. the company's existence would not depend on the success or failure of individual voyages, but on the overall profitability of the enterprise across years and decades. To compensate investors for this permanent commitment of capital, the company would issue shares. These shares represented fractional ownership. If the company's total capital was divided into, say, 10,000 parts, and you owned one of those parts, you owned 1/10,000th of everything the company possessed. The ships, the warehouses, the trading posts, the inventory of spices, the claims to future profits, all of it divided proportionally among the shareholders. Your share entitled you to receive dividends when the company distributed profits. And crucially, if you needed your capital back, you didn't withdraw it from the company. Instead, you sold your share to someone else. The capital stayed in the company, but ownership changed hands. This innovation, simple to describe but profound in its implications, transformed commerce. It solved the problem of locked capital. An investor could commit money to the VOC knowing that if circumstances changed, if he needed funds for other purposes, he could sell his shares and recover his investment. The price he received might be more or less than he had originally paid, depending on the company's fortunes and the market's assessment of its prospects. But the shares could be sold. They were transferable, negotiable, a new kind of property that could move from person to person while the underlying assets remained with the company. The capital was raised in the spring and summer of 1602. 6 chambers based in different Dutch cities conducted the subscription. Amsterdam, as the largest commercial centre, raised the most, eventually gathering about 3,400,000 guilders. Zeeland, which included the city of Middelburg, raised 1,300,000 guilders. The smaller chambers in Delft, Rotterdam, Hoorn, and Enkhuizen raised the remainder. In total, the initial capital of the VOC reached approximately 6,500,000 guilders, an enormous sum, the largest capital pool ever assembled for a commercial venture. To understand what 6,500,000 guilders meant, imagine it in terms of purchasing power. A skilled craftsman in Amsterdam might earn 300 guilders in a year, enough to live modestly but comfortably. A substantial house in a good neighbourhood might cost 3,000 guilders. So, the VOC's capital represented the equivalent of more than 21,000 years of skilled labour, or enough to purchase over 2,000 fine houses. It was a concentration of wealth so large that no individual merchant commanded anything approaching it. Only by pooling the resources of thousands of investors could such a sum be gathered, and those investors were varied. The wealthiest merchants invested heavily, of course. Some put in tens of thousands of guilders, enormous sums that represented significant portions of their total wealth. But the subscription was also open to more modest investors. Shopkeepers, clerks, widows with inheritances, even servants with savings, all could purchase shares. The minimum investment was 3,000 guilders, beyond the reach of the truly poor but accessible to the comfortable middle classes. Some investors bought fractional shares, pooling their resources with friends or family members to meet the minimum. The VOC became, in a sense, a national investment, a collective enterprise in which thousands of Dutch citizens held stakes. Picture the day of subscription in Amsterdam, the clerk sitting at long tables in the East India House, the Oostindische Huis, recording each investment. Investors arrived throughout the day, some with bags of coins, others with letters of credit, a few with bills of exchange drawn on other cities. Each transaction was carefully documented. Name, amount invested, the chamber in which the shares were registered. The quills scratched across paper, ink drying slowly, each entry adding to the total. Some investors spoke with the clerks at length, asking questions about the company's plans, about when dividends might be expected, about the rights that shareholders would possess. Others simply paid their money and left, trusting that the investment would prove sound. The company structure was federal rather than unified. Each chamber maintained considerable autonomy, managing its own investments, building its own ships, maintaining its own warehouses. But overall direction came from the Heeren 17th, the 17 gentlemen, a board of directors drawn from the various chambers. Amsterdam, because of its larger capital contribution, received 8 seats. Zeeland received 4. The 4 smaller chambers shared the remaining 4 seats, with 1 seat rotating among them. The final seat, the 17th, alternated between Amsterdam and Zeeland, ensuring that no single chamber could dominate completely. This structure balanced regional interests, giving each area voice proportional to its investment, while preventing any one city from controlling the entire enterprise. The Heeren 16th met infrequently, perhaps 2 or 3 times a year, alternating between Amsterdam and Middelburg. These meetings lasted days, sometimes weeks, as the directors reviewed reports from Asia, approved budgets, set prices for spices sold in Europe, determined dividend policy, and made the countless other decisions required to manage a transcontinental enterprise. The meetings were formal, conducted according to rules that emphasized deliberation and consensus. Minutes were kept, recording decisions for future reference. The directors understood that they were managing not just their own money, but the investments of thousands of shareholders, a responsibility they took seriously. The company began operations immediately after the capital was raised. Ships that had been under construction for the various voorcompagnieën were transferred to the VOC. Contracts with crews were assumed. Trading posts that individual companies had established in Asia became VOC property. The consolidation happened quickly, driven by the practical urgency of the trading season. Ships needed to depart before winter made the journey even more dangerous. Supplies needed to be procured, crews assembled, cargoes of trade goods loaded. The administration of merger happened even as operations continued, the company becoming itself while already in motion. The accounting innovation was perhaps as important as the structural one, though less immediately obvious. In the voorcompagnie system, accounting was simple. Capital invested plus expenses incurred equaled total costs. Revenue from selling spices minus total costs equaled profit or loss. The books closed when the voyage ended, the partnership dissolved, and that was that. But the VOC's books never closed in that sense. The company was a going concern, its operations continuous, its capital permanent. This required a different approach to accounting, one that could track value over time, that could distinguish between capital and revenue, between assets and expenses. The VOC's accountants, working without clear precedents, developed methods that would later become standard. They tracked the company's assets, the value of ships, inventories, buildings, cash on hand. They recorded liabilities, amounts owed to suppliers or lenders. The difference between assets and liabilities represented the shareholders' equity, the net value of their collective investment. Revenues from selling spices were recorded when sales occurred. Expenses were recorded as they were incurred. The difference between revenues and expenses over some period represented the profit available for distribution to shareholders or for retention in the business. This might seem obvious now, these basic principles of accounting that every business student learns. But in 1602, it was new, a conceptual framework being worked out in practice, adjusted as problems arose, refined through experience. The accountants were inventing as they worked, creating the tools that would allow the company to understand its own financial position, to report to shareholders, to make rational decisions about dividends and reinvestment. The ledgers they maintained, those columns of figures in neat handwriting, represented a new way of seeing economic activity, of quantifying value, making the invisible visible. The first ships under the Vock banner departed in 1603. 14 ships in total, their holds filled with trade goods, silver for purchasing spices, supplies for the crews, and gifts for Asian rulers whose goodwill would be necessary for trade. The ships sailed from Texel in groups, small fleets that would stay together for mutual protection during the dangerous crossing. Each ship carried a captain and officers, a crew of sailors and soldiers, a merchant who would conduct the actual trading once they reached Asia, and a supercargo who would maintain detailed records of all transactions. The ships were the company-made manifest, the physical extension of all that capital and planning into the wider world. The innovation of perpetual capital meant that the company could plan long-term in ways that voorcompagnieën never could. A trading post could be established in Asia, staffed year-round, maintained through multiple trading seasons. Relationships with local rulers and merchants could be built over years rather than individual voyages. The company could store inventory in Asian warehouses during off-seasons, waiting for optimal times to ship goods to Europe. It could make investments that would pay off only over decades, secure in the knowledge that the capital would remain available, that the company's existence didn't depend on the success of the next voyage or two. This long-term perspective also changed how risks were managed. In the voorcompagnieën system, a single disastrous voyage could wipe out an investor's capital in that venture, though his other investments remained separate. In the VOC, risks were pooled across the entire enterprise. A lost ship was certainly unfortunate, but it was one loss absorbed by the company as a whole, its costs spread across all shareholders proportionally. Some voyages would fail, some would succeed brilliantly, most would fall somewhere in between. But the overall portfolio, the aggregate of all the company's activities, would determine shareholders' returns. This diversification, built into the structure itself, made the investment more stable, less exposed to the catastrophic losses that could afflict individual voyages. The VOC also inherited from the charter a quasi-governmental authority. The company could make treaties with Asian rulers, build forts and military installations, maintain armed forces, administer justice in territories under its control, even wage war if necessary to protect its commercial interests. This was unusual, though not unprecedented. The charter essentially deputized the company as an agent of Dutch state power in Asia, allowing it to act with sovereign authority far from the oversight of the States General. The practical necessity was clear. Amsterdam was months away from Batavia by sail, and the company's employees needed to be able to act quickly to respond to threats or opportunities without waiting for instructions that would be obsolete by the time they arrived. But this governmental authority also blurred the line between company and state, between commercial enterprise and political entity. The VOC was both, a hybrid creation that existed to generate profits for shareholders, but also served Dutch national interests, projecting power, claiming territory, competing with European rivals for Asian trade. The costs of this dual nature would become apparent later, but in 1602 the arrangement seemed natural and necessary, the only way a company operating at such distance could function effectively. In Amsterdam, as the first Voorsee ships disappeared over the horizon, something else was beginning to happen, something that would prove as revolutionary as the joint stock structure itself. Shareholders began to trade their shares with each other. Someone who had invested 3,000 guilders and now needed money might approach another merchant offering to sell his share. The buyer and seller would negotiate a price, perhaps 3,000 guilders if they believed the share's value hadn't changed, perhaps more if news from the East had been encouraging, perhaps less if rumours suggested trouble. A contract would be drawn up, the ownership transfer recorded in the company's books, and the share would change hands. At first, these transactions were private, informal, arranged between individuals who knew each other or were connected through networks of trust. But gradually patterns emerged. Certain merchants became known as willing buyers of VOC shares. Others regularly sold shares, perhaps because they needed liquidity, perhaps because they were speculating, buying low and selling high. The transactions began to happen in predictable places at certain times, in the spaces where merchants naturally gathered. The courtyard of the Amsterdam Exchange building, completed in 1611, became a favourite spot. Here, among the columns and under the sky, merchants met to trade not just physical goods but also pieces of paper representing ownership in distant enterprises. This secondary market in VOC shares was unprecedented. Never before had ownership in a business enterprise been so readily transferable, so liquid. The shares were beginning to take on characteristics of money itself, accepted in payment, serving as stores of value, circulating through the economy, independent of the company's operations. A widow might hold VOC shares as an investment, counting on dividends for her livelihood. A merchant might accept shares in payment for goods, confident he could sell them when he needed cash. A speculator might buy shares, hoping their price would rise, planning to sell at a profit. The price of shares fluctuated based on news and expectations. When a fleet returned safely with holds full of valuable spices, share prices rose as investors recognized that profits would be distributed. When news arrived of ships lost or of conflicts with Portuguese forces, prices fell as the costs and risks became apparent. When the company announced a dividend payment, prices often rose in anticipation and then fell slightly after the payment was made. The market was developing its own logic, its own patterns, driven by the collective assessments of thousands of individuals, each making their own judgments about value and prospect. The company itself remained somewhat aloof from this secondary trading. The VOC's books recorded who owned shares because dividends needed to be paid to the correct individuals, but the company didn't control or regulate the price at which shares traded. That was a matter between buyer and seller, determined by negotiation, reflecting their private judgments about value. The company's role was simply to maintain accurate ownership records, to update them when shares changed hands, and to distribute dividends according to the recorded ownership at the time of payment. By the end of 1602, the VOC was fully operational. Ships were at sea, capital was deployed, The administrative apparatus was functioning, and shares were beginning to trade in Amsterdam and other Dutch cities. The innovation was complete, though its full implications would take decades to unfold. A new form of organisation had been created, one that would prove extraordinarily durable and influential. The joint stock company with transferable shares, permanent capital, and separation between ownership and management. It was all there. Established not through grand theoretical insight, but through practical problem solving, through merchants trying to organise their trade more efficiently, through the gradual recognition that capital could be made perpetual, that ownership could be made liquid, that a company could outlive the founders who created it. And in counting houses across Amsterdam and the other chamber cities, accountants sat at their desks recording transactions in their ledgers, tracking the flow of money and goods, maintaining the financial records that made the whole system possible. The quills scratched steadily across paper, each entry adding to the collective knowledge of the company's state. Capital raised, here recorded. Expenses paid, here noted. Ships departed, their cargoes enumerated. Shares transferred, the new owners documented. The accounting was as important as the sailing, the bookkeeping as essential as the trading. Without these records, without this careful documentation, the company would have been chaos. But with them, the VOC was knowable, its condition accessible, its operations manageable despite spanning half the world. The charter had been granted, the capital had been raised, the structure had been established, the ships had sailed. And without fanfare, without proclamation, without anyone fully understanding what had been created, the world had changed. Commerce had found a new form, one that would persist for centuries, that would spread from Amsterdam to every continent, that would become the dominant structure for organising large-scale economic activity. The VOC was the first, the prototype, the original experiment in corporate capitalism, and as 1602 gave way to 1603, as the ships sailed further east and the clerks continued their careful accounting, the experiment was already succeeding beyond anything its architects had imagined possible. The ships that sailed for the VOC were substantial vessels built for the long journey and the dual purposes of commerce and defence. A typical East India man, as these ships came to be called, measured perhaps 40 metres in length, with 3 masts carrying square-rigged sails that could catch the wind from almost any direction. The hull was built of oak, thick and strong, designed to withstand months at sea and the occasional cannon shot. Below deck, the cargo hold could accommodate hundreds of tons of the goods, while above, the gun deck carried 20 or 30 cannon, enough to discourage pirates or defend against rival European ships. The construction of these vessels was itself a major enterprise. Shipyards along the waterways near Amsterdam worked continuously, building new ships to replace those lost to storms or age, expanding the fleet as the company's operations grew. The work was slow and required extraordinary skill. Carpenters selected timbers, choosing pieces with the right grain and curve for particular parts of the hull. The keel was laid first, the backbone of the ship, a single massive timber, or several joined together, running the entire length of the vessel. Ribs were attached to the keel, creating the skeleton that would define the ship's shape. Planks were fitted to the ribs, each one carefully shaped, fastened with wooden pegs and iron nails, caulked with oakum and tar to keep water out. A single ship might take a year or more to build, employing dozens of craftsmen whose skills had been developed over generations. the VUC's demand for ships created steady work for these shipyards, a reliable income that allowed the craftsmen to plan their own lives with some certainty. The company paid well, on time, and always needed more ships. This relationship between the VOC and the shipbuilding industry became one of the hidden foundations of Dutch prosperity. Capital flowing from the company to craftsmen, from craftsmen to suppliers of timber and rope and canvas, spreading through the economy in ways that touched thousands of lives. The ships, once completed, needed crews. A large East Indiaman might carry 150 to 200 men, sometimes more. The crew included sailors who worked the rigging and sails, soldiers who would defend the ship and garrison trading posts, craftsmen who could repair damage during the voyage, a cook and his assistants, officers who commanded the various departments, and the captain who bore ultimate responsibility. Finding enough men willing to make the journey was a constant challenge. The voyage was dangerous, the work was hard, and many who sailed east never returned, victims of disease or shipwreck or violence. The company offered wages that seemed generous to men with few alternatives, but those wages had to compensate for extraordinary risk. The daily life aboard ship during the months at sea settled into rhythms as regular as the watches that divided the day. Sailors worked in shifts, maintaining the vessel, adjusting sails to catch the wind, pumping water from the bilge, standing watch for other ships or dangerous weather. Meals were simple: ship's biscuit and salt meat, occasionally supplemented by fish caught along the way or fresh provisions taken on at ports during the journey. The officers ate better, their cabins supplied with wine and cheese, dried fruits and better cuts of meat, the small privileges of rank that made the endless voyage slightly more bearable. Below deck, in the dark and cramped spaces where most of the crew lived, men slept in hammocks slung between beams, their few possessions stored in sea chests or hung from nails. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tar, bilge water, and the cargo stored nearby. Privacy was impossible, personal space minimal. The men lived pressed together, their lives intertwined by proximity and shared danger. Friendships formed, feuds developed, hierarchies emerged based on age and experience and strength. The ship became a small society unto itself, carrying its passengers across oceans, holding them in suspension between the world they had left and the world they sailed toward. The route itself was well established by the time the VOC began operations. Ships departed from Texel or other Dutch ports, sailed southwest across the Atlantic, staying far from Spanish-controlled coasts, caught the trade winds that would carry them south and east toward the Cape of Good Hope. The crossing to the Cape took months, these ships stopping occasionally at islands for fresh water and provisions. Some ships anchored at the Cape itself, that great promontory where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet, taking on supplies for the second half of the journey. Later, the Dutch would establish a permanent settlement there, a refreshment station where VOC ships could resupply, and that settlement would eventually become Cape Town, a city that still exists, its origin tied directly to the company's logistical needs. From the Cape, the ship sailed northeast, across the Indian Ocean toward the Indonesian archipelago. This leg of the journey could be faster if the winds were favourable, slower if they were not. The monsoon patterns governed travel in these waters, winds that blew steadily from one direction for months and then reversed, blowing from the opposite direction for the next season. Experienced captains learned to work with these patterns, timing their voyages to catch favourable winds, waiting in port when the monsoons were contrary. The wind itself became a kind of clock, marking the seasons, dictating the rhythm of trade. The destination was usually Batavia, the city the Dutch established on the island of Java in 1619. Before Batavia, the VOC had maintained trading posts in several locations, but none had served as an effective headquarters. Batavia, built on the ruins of an earlier settlement called Jayakarta, was strategically located at the centre of the Indonesian spice trade. From Batavia, VOC ships could reach the various spice-producing islands, could trade with merchants from across Asia, could coordinate the company's far-flung operations. The city was built in Dutch style, with canals and brick houses, an attempt to recreate Amsterdam in the tropics, though the heat and humidity made such architecture less practical than it was in Europe. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, who served as Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies, was the principal architect of Batavia. Cohen was ruthlessly focused on the company's commercial interests, willing to use force to establish Dutch dominance in the spice trade. Under his leadership, the VOC built fortifications, maintained a standing military force, and engaged in conflicts with indigenous rulers and European competitors. These activities were expensive, requiring constant outlays for soldiers' wages, weapons, ammunition, and fort construction. The costs were justified, in the company's view, by the profits that monopoly control would generate. If the VOC could control the supply of nutmeg and cloves, could prevent competitors from accessing these spices, the company could charge whatever prices European markets would bear. The trading posts, or factories as they were called, were permanent establishments where VOC employees lived year-round. A typical factory consisted of a fortified warehouse, living quarters for the merchant and his staff, and facilities for receiving and storing goods. The factor, the merchant in charge, maintained relationships with local traders, negotiated prices, arranged for the purchase of spices and other goods, and oversaw the loading of ships when they arrived. Some factors spent years in these posts, learning local languages, adapting to local customs, developing networks of relationships that made trade possible. The work was isolating, far from home and family, with little prospect of return until the company decided to rotate personnel. The trade itself involved complex negotiations. Local growers and merchants had their own interests, their own understanding of value, their own reasons for trading or refusing to trade. The VOC employees had to navigate these relationships carefully, offering trade goods that locals wanted, silver when necessary, and sometimes threats or force when persuasion failed. The company's ideal was monopoly, exclusive rights to purchase all the spices from particular regions, enforced by contract with local rulers. But reality was messier. Other traders, including indigenous merchants and rival European companies, competed for the same goods. The VOC's efforts to enforce its monopolies sometimes led to conflicts, blockades, the destruction of spice trees to limit supply, and other measures that blurred the line between commerce and coercion. The goods that flowed through this network were diverse. Spices remained the most valuable, pepper from the Malabar coast of India, nutmeg and mace from the Banda Islands, cloves from the Moluccas, cinnamon from Ceylon. But the VOC also traded in textiles, particularly Indian cotton cloth that was highly prized in Southeast Asia. Chinese porcelain, tea, and silk entered the trade network, purchased in Chinese ports or through intermediaries. Japanese copper and silver, obtained from trading posts in Nagasaki, where the VOC was one of the few European entities allowed to trade. The variety created complexity but also opportunity. A ship might leave Amsterdam with silver and European trade goods, exchange those for textiles in India, trade the textiles for spices in Indonesia, and return to Amsterdam with a hold full of valuable cargo assembled through multiple exchanges across thousands of miles. The accounting for all this activity was extraordinarily complex. Each factory maintained its own books, recording purchases and sales, tracking inventory, noting expenses for salaries and supplies. These records were periodically sent to Batavia, where they were consolidated into reports for the Governor-General. From Batavia, summary reports were sent to Amsterdam, though the information was always months or years out of date by the time it arrived. The Heer and Sixtante, meeting in Amsterdam or Middelburg, made decisions based on information that described circumstances that no longer existed. They might order the purchase of more pepper, only to learn a year later that the market had shifted, that Chinese merchants had flooded the region with pepper, driving down prices. The distance created fundamental management challenges, gaps between decision and execution that no amount of careful planning could entirely bridge. The employees who staffed this far-flung operation were a varied group. Some were ambitious young men from good families, seeking their fortunes in the East, hoping to return wealthy enough to live comfortably in the Netherlands. Others were adventurers or misfits, men who had failed in Europe and saw the VOC as a final opportunity. The company employed soldiers, many of them Germans or Scandinavians, hired as mercenaries to garrison forts and protect trade routes. The pay was modest, but regular, and for men with few skills and fewer prospects, VOC service offered at least the possibility of survival and perhaps even advancement. The corruption that would later plague the company was present from the beginning, though it took decades to become truly endemic. VOC employees in Asia quickly realized that the company's official business provided opportunities for private trade. A factor purchasing spices for the VOC might also purchase a small quantity for himself, shipping it back to Amsterdam in company vessels and selling it privately. The profits from such trade could far exceed the salary the company paid. Technically, this private trade was forbidden, but enforcement was nearly impossible. How could Amsterdam determine whether a particular shipment of pepper belonged to the company or to an individual employee? The records could be falsified, the transactions concealed, and by the time any investigation occurred, the evidence would be scattered across thousands of miles and months of time. Some employees grew wealthy through this private trade, returning to the Netherlands after a decade in the East with fortunes that allowed them to purchase estates, live as gentlemen, and never work again. Their success encouraged others to seek VOC employment for the same reason, not to serve the company faithfully, but to exploit its infrastructure for personal gain. The company tolerated a certain amount of this activity, recognizing that employees underpaid for dangerous work in harsh climates would find ways to supplement their income. But the line between tolerated perquisite and damaging theft was never clear, and the cumulative effect of thousands of employees each taking a small portion gradually became a significant drain on company profits. The military burden also grew heavier over time. The VOC maintained forts across Asia, garrisoned by soldiers whose wages and supplies had to be paid from company revenues. These forts protected trade routes, intimidated rivals, and asserted Dutch control over strategic locations. But they were also expensive, requiring constant maintenance, periodic reinforcement, and occasional use in conflicts that might last years. The company found itself fighting wars, sometimes against European rivals, sometimes against Asian powers, always at considerable cost. These military operations were justified as necessary for protecting trade, but they transformed the VOC from a purely commercial enterprise into something closer to a colonial power, with all the costs and complications that entailed. The ships that connected this network made 2 or 3 voyages during their working lives, if they were fortunate. Many were lost to storms in the treacherous waters around the Cape of Good Hope, to shoals and reefs in Indonesian waters where charts were incomplete and local knowledge essential, to fire, which was an ever-present danger aboard wooden ships carrying flammable cargo. The company accepted these losses as part of the business, building more ships to replace those lost, maintaining a fleet large enough that individual disasters didn't cripple operations. The insurance for these vessels was often provided by the company itself, a form of self-insurance that spread the risk across all shareholders rather than paying premiums to external insurers. In the warehouses of Amsterdam and the other chamber cities, the goods that returned from Asia were carefully managed. The spices arrived in various conditions, some in perfect state, others damaged by water or age or pests. The warehouse staff sorted the cargo, separating the premium quality from the inferior, preparing it for auction. The VOC sold most of its imported goods through public auctions where merchants bid for lots of spices, textiles, porcelain, and other items. These auctions were major commercial events, attended by merchants from across Europe, who came to Amsterdam specifically to purchase Eastern goods. The prices achieved at auction directly affected the company's revenues and thus its ability to pay dividends to shareholders. The company tried to manage these auctions carefully, controlling the supply released to market, trying to maintain prices at levels that maximize revenue without driving buyers away. If too much of a particular spice was released at once, the price would fall as supply exceeded demand. If too little was released, the company left money on the table, failing to satisfy market demand that would have generated additional revenue. Finding the balance required judgment, an understanding of market conditions, and a willingness to hold inventory when necessary, waiting for more favourable circumstances before selling. The inventory itself represented a significant capital investment. Goods sitting in warehouses weren't generating income until sold. The longer they sat, the more capital was tied up in inventory, rather than available for other purposes. But rushing to sell at unfavourable prices would destroy value. The company's managers had to navigate this tension constantly, making decisions about when to sell and how much to release, decisions that could significantly affect profitability. The accountants tracked it all, inventory moving from one category to another, from goods in transit to goods in warehouse to goods sold, each transition recorded, each change in status documented in the ledgers that told the company's financial story. The flow of goods through this system was steady but slow. A ship leaving Amsterdam in, say, 1620 might reach Batavia in 1621, spend months trading and loading cargo, depart for Amsterdam in 1622 and arrive home in 1623. The spices purchased in 1621 might not be sold in Amsterdam until 1623 or even 1624. The time from initial investment to final return stretched across years, capital moving slowly through the cycle of purchase, transport, storage, and sale. This slowness was simply the nature of early modern trade, the consequence of distance and sailing ship technology, accepted by all participants as the unavoidable reality of doing business across such vast spaces. And yet, despite the slowness, despite the corruption and military costs and inevitable losses, the system worked. The VOC's ships sailed and returned, the spices flowed into European markets, the auctions generated revenues, and the shareholders, waiting patiently in Amsterdam and the other chamber cities, received their dividends. The company had created a machine for moving value across the world, for transforming Eastern goods into European money, for connecting producers and consumers separated by oceans and cultures and languages. The machine was imperfect, inefficient by modern standards, prone to break down and requiring constant maintenance. But it functioned year after year, decade after decade, generating profits that would make the VOC one of the most successful commercial enterprises in history. While ships sailed between Amsterdam and the East Indies, carrying spices and silver and the hopes of distant investors, another kind of trade was developing in Amsterdam itself, a trade in paper rather than pepper, in shares rather than ships. The VOC's innovation of permanent capital and transferable shares had created something unexpected, a secondary market where ownership in the company could be bought and sold independent of the company's own operations. This market, informal at first, gradually became organized, developing its own locations, customs, and participants. It was the birth of something that would transform finance, the emergence of the stock exchange as we know it today. The trading happened wherever merchants gathered, but certain locations became favoured. The courtyard of Amsterdam's Beurs, the exchange building completed in 1611, became a natural meeting place. The building itself was impressive, designed by Hendrik de Keyser in a style that combined classical elements with Dutch practicality. The courtyard was open to the sky, surrounded by covered walkways where merchants could conduct business sheltered from rain. Here, among the columns and beneath the Dutch clouds, men gathered to trade not just physical goods, but also pieces of paper representing fractional ownership in enterprises they would never directly control. The mechanics of trading were simple in principle, but required trust and record-keeping to function. A seller, holding a share certificate or having his ownership recorded in the VOC's books, would find a buyer willing to purchase at an agreed price. They might negotiate directly, or through intermediaries who specialized in matching buyers and sellers. Once a price was agreed, the transaction would be recorded, the seller signing over his rights, the buyer's name replacing the seller's in the company's ownership records. The VOC maintained these records in its chambers, updating them as shares changed hands, because accurate ownership records were essential for distributing dividends to the correct parties. The price at which shares traded was not fixed by the company, but emerged from the negotiations between buyers and sellers. This price discovery process, as it would later be called, reflected the collective judgment of everyone participating in the market. If more people wanted to buy VOC shares and wanted to sell, prices would rise as buyers bid against each other. If more wanted to sell than buy, prices would fall as sellers competed to find willing buyers. The price at any moment represented a kind of consensus, an aggregate opinion about what a share in the VOC was worth. What determined this worth? The company's prospects, certainly. news from the East affected share prices significantly. When word arrived that a fleet had returned safely with valuable cargo, prices typically rose as investors recognized that the company's revenues would increase and dividends might be paid. When news came of ships lost or conflicts with Portuguese or English forces, prices often fell as investors reassessed the risks and costs. The lag in information, the 6 months or more between events in Asia and news reaching Amsterdam, created opportunities and dangers. Those who received news first, perhaps through private correspondence or advance word from ship captains, could trade on that information before the broader market learned of it. The expected dividends also influenced prices. If the company announced that a dividend would be paid, share prices might rise as the distribution date approached, reflecting the value of that forthcoming payment. After the dividend was paid, prices sometimes fell slightly, a pattern that puzzled some observers but made sense to those who understood that the company's cash reserves had been reduced by the distribution. A share entitled you to future dividends, and a company that had just paid out a large sum had, in that moment, less cash available for future payments, even if the payment itself was evidence of profitability. The interest rates on other investments mattered as well. A VOC share competed for capital with other possible uses of money. Someone with 3,000 guilders to invest might buy a VOC share, or might lend the money to a merchant at interest, or might purchase land, or might invest in a different trading venture. If interest rates on loans rose, making lending more attractive, some shareholders might sell their VOC shares to move capital into lending. If land prices fell, making property more attractive, some might sell shares to buy estates. The VOC share price, then, reflected not just the company's prospects in isolation, but its attractiveness relative to all other investment opportunities available to Dutch investors. Picture a widow living in Amsterdam in the 1620s, her late husband having left her with a modest estate that included several VOC shares. She relies on the dividends from these shares to supplement the income from her other assets. Each year, when the company pays its dividend, she receives her proportional share, enough to maintain her household, pay her servants, purchase necessities. She has no desire to sell the shares, which provide reliable income and seem likely to continue doing so. But she watches their price nonetheless, checking periodically with merchants who trade in such things, because the shares represent a significant portion of her wealth and she wants to understand her financial position. The price fluctuates, she learns. Last year the shares traded at perhaps 400% of their original price, meaning a share initially costing 3,000 guilders might sell for 12,000 guilders. This year, after news of ships lost in a storm, the price has fallen to perhaps 375%. She considers these numbers calmly. She has no immediate need to sell, and the dividend income continues regardless of the share price fluctuations. The shares are worth what someone would pay for them, but that theoretical value matters less to her than the actual income they generate year after year. Others approached VOC shares differently. Some merchants bought and sold shares regularly, not for the dividend income but for capital gains, the profit from buying low and selling high. These speculators, as they came to be called, watched share prices closely, trying to anticipate movements, buying when they believed prices would rise and selling when they expected prices to fall. This speculation was controversial, some viewing it as legitimate commerce, others seeing it as immoral gambling, profiting from price movements rather than from actual productive activity. but the speculators provided liquidity to the market, always willing to buy or sell, making it easier for long-term investors like the widow to find counterparties when they actually needed to trade. The coffee houses near the Bourse became centres of information exchange and trading. Merchants gathered in these establishments to drink coffee or chocolate, to read newspapers and correspondence, to discuss business and politics, and to trade shares and other financial instruments. The coffee house served as an informal extension of the exchange, a place where deals were negotiated, gossip was shared, and news was analysed. The proprietors of successful coffee houses became wealthy, their establishments essential infrastructure for the financial market that was developing in Amsterdam. Isaac Lemaire was among the most notable early speculators in VOC shares. Lemaire had been involved in the voorcompagnieën before the VOC's formation and had become a major shareholder in the United Company. But he grew dissatisfied with the VOC's management, believing the Heren 17th were not maximising shareholder value, that they were too conservative, too focused on their own interests rather than shareholders' returns. In 1609, Lemaire organised what may have been history's first bear raid, a coordinated attempt to drive down VOC share prices through strategic selling. Lemaire and several associates sold VOC shares they didn't own, a practice that became known as short selling. The mechanism worked as follows. Lemaire would contract to sell shares at a fixed price for delivery at some future date, perhaps 3 months hence. He received payment immediately or at delivery, but he didn't need to own the shares at the moment he made the contract. His bet was that share prices would fall during those 3 months. If they did, he could purchase shares at the lower price just before the delivery date and deliver them to fulfill his contract, pocketing the difference between the high price at which he had sold and the low price at which he had bought. To ensure that prices did fall, Lemaire spread rumours about VOC troubles, commissioned pamphlets criticising the company's management, and coordinated selling to flood the market with shares. The campaign was sophisticated and partially successful. Share prices did decline, creating panic among some shareholders and profit for Lemaire and his associates. But the VOC's directors fought back, first through market operations, buying shares to support prices, and then through legal and political means. They persuaded the States General to ban short selling, making Lemaire's tactics illegal. The ban was formalised in 1610, making it unlawful to sell shares one did not own. The Lemaire affair revealed both the potential and the dangers of the market that had emerged. On one hand, the ability to short sell allowed sophisticated investors to express negative views about a company's prospects, potentially serving as a check on management and providing information to other market participants. On the other hand, short selling could be abused, used to manipulate prices for personal gain, at the expense of long-term shareholders and the company itself. The tension between these perspectives would persist for centuries, with short selling repeatedly banned and then allowed, regulated and then deregulated, as successive generations grappled with the same fundamental questions Lemaire's actions had raised. Despite the ban on short selling, other forms of derivative trading continued and expanded. Options contracts, agreements to buy or sell shares at a fixed price at some future date, became common in the Amsterdam market. These contracts allowed investors to speculate on future price movements or to hedge their positions, reducing risk. A shareholder worried that prices might fall could purchase a put option, the right to sell shares at a fixed price, protecting himself against losses if prices did indeed decline. Someone expecting prices to rise could buy a call option, the right to purchase shares at a fixed price, profiting if prices rose above that level without having to invest the full capital required to buy the shares outright. These options traded in the coffee houses and the exchange courtyard just as the shares themselves did. The contracts were standardized to some degree, with common expiration dates and strike prices, making them easier to trade. A secondary market in options developed, people buying and selling the contracts themselves rather than exercising the rights they conveyed. The complexity grew, layers of financial instruments building on top of the underlying shares, each layer creating new opportunities for profit or loss, new ways to express views about the future, new mechanisms for transferring risk from those who wish to avoid it to those willing to bear it for a price. The accounting for these transactions was challenging. The VOC's books recorded share ownership, but they didn't track the options, contracts, or short positions or other derivatives that individuals traded among themselves. These private contracts existed parallel to the official ownership records, a shadow system of claims and obligations that the company itself neither created nor controlled. Someone might appear in the VOC's books as owning 100 shares, but he might also have sold call options on 50 of those shares, creating obligations that didn't appear in any official record. The market had become more complex than the company's record-keeping could fully capture. The prices themselves were disseminated informally through the merchant networks. There was no official ticker tape, no centralized quotation system. Share prices were simply what people reported having paid in recent transactions. Merchants would ask each other, "What are VOC shares trading at today?" And the answer would be an approximation based on recent deals, perhaps a range, maybe 350 to 360% of pair, indicating that different transactions had occurred at different prices within that band. This informal price dissemination worked well enough for a market where everyone knew everyone else, and trust was personal rather than institutional. Over time, certain merchants specialized in market making, standing ready to buy or sell shares at quoted prices. These market makers earned their profits from the spread, the difference between the price at which they would buy and the price at which they would sell. If a market maker would buy at 350% and sell at 360%, he made 10% on each round trip, buying from one party and selling to another. This spread compensated the market maker for the risk of holding inventory, of owning shares that might fall in value before he could sell them, and for the service of providing liquidity to the market, making it possible for others to trade quickly rather than waiting to find counterparties themselves. The volume of trading grew steadily through the early decades of the EVUC's existence. In the 1620s and 1630s, thousands of shares changed hands each year, the paper circulating through Amsterdam and the other chamber cities, ownership shifting as investors' circumstances and views changed. Some shares traded frequently, passing through multiple owners in a single year. Others remained with the same families for decades, held as long-term investments, sources of reliable dividend income, portions of estates, passed from generation to generation. The market accommodated both types of investors, the long-term holders and the active traders, each pursuing their own strategies, each contributing to the liquidity that made the market function. The dividends themselves varied significantly from year to year. In profitable years, when many ships returned safely and auctions generated strong revenues, the company might distribute 30 or 40% of share value as dividends. In difficult years, when fewer ships returned or expenses were unusually high, dividends might be much smaller or even non-existent. This variability meant that the dividend yield, the annual dividend as a percentage of share price, fluctuated as well. In a year with a generous dividend of 40% of par value and a share price of 400% of par, the yield would be 10%. In a year with a small dividend of 10% of par and the same share price, the yield would be only 2.5%. Investors had to judge whether the dividends they would receive over time justified the price they paid for shares. A share purchased at 400% of par would need to generate dividends totaling 400% just to return the initial investment, not counting the opportunity cost of capital that could have been invested elsewhere. The shares would need to generate dividends beyond that to provide a positive return. This calculation required estimating future dividends, which in turn required assessing the VOC's prospects, the competitive environment in Asian trade, the likely expenses and risks, the effectiveness of management. No one could know these things with certainty, so investors made judgments, estimates based on incomplete information, bets on an unknowable future. The market price reflected the collective result of thousands of these individual judgments. When most investors were optimistic, believing future dividends would be generous, they bid prices up. When pessimism dominated, believing dividends would disappoint, prices fell. The price served as a kind of oracle, aggregating dispersed information and opinion into a single number that represented, however imperfectly, the market's best guess about what the company was worth. Modern financial theory would formalize this idea, developing concepts like efficient markets and rational expectations. But the basic insight was already operating in 17th century Amsterdam. Prices incorporate information, and market prices, for all their imperfections, often represent better forecasts than any individual could produce alone. The speculation sometimes became excessive, prices rising based more on momentum and enthusiasm than on sober assessment of fundamentals. When prices were rising, people wanted to buy, hoping to profit from further increases, and their buying pushed prices higher still, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Eventually reality would intrude, some piece of bad news would break the spell, and prices would fall sharply as the same momentum that had driven them up now drove them down. These cycles of enthusiasm and despair, of bubble and crash, would become familiar patterns in financial markets over the following centuries. The Amsterdam market in VOC shares experienced them early, learning painful lessons about speculation that later generations would have to relearn for themselves. Yet through all the speculation and volatility, through the schemes of manipulators and the anxieties of investors, the market served its essential function. It allowed the VOC to raise permanent capital without any individual investor having to commit permanently. It provided liquidity, the ability to convert shares into cash when needed. It facilitated price discovery, revealing what informed participants believed the shares were worth. And it created a mechanism through which risk could be transferred from those less able or willing to bear it to those who were. These functions, pioneered in Amsterdam's market for VOC shares, would become central to modern capitalism, essential features of the financial infrastructure that enables large-scale enterprise. As you imagine this market, picture the exchange courtyard on a busy day. Merchants gathered in clusters, conversations overlapping, deals being negotiated in low voices, hands shaking to seal agreements, scribes recording transactions in their notebooks. The widow stops by to inquire about her shares' current value, satisfied to learn they remain steady. A young merchant buys his first shares, a modest investment but one that makes him part owner of a vast enterprise spanning continents. An elderly trader sells shares he has held for 20 years, converting his ownership into cash to fund his retirement. A speculator watches prices carefully, waiting for the moment to buy or sell, hoping his judgment about future movements will prove correct. The paper circulates, ownership shifts, and somewhere far away, Vox ships continue sailing, their cargoes representing the underlying value that all this trading, all this speculation and investment and market making ultimately depends upon. The decades that followed the company's founding brought what shareholders would later remember as the Golden Age, a long period of sustained profitability when the VOC's operations reached their peak effectiveness and the returns to investors reflected the success of that vast commercial machine spanning half the world. This was not dramatic wealth appearing suddenly, not fortunes made overnight through speculation or luck. Rather, it was the steady accumulation of profit year after year, the reliable flow of dividends that allowed families to plan their futures with confidence, knowing that their VOC shares would generate income as predictably as land generated rent or bonds generated interest. The 1630s through the 1670s marked the company's most consistently profitable period. The VOC had established its dominance over the spice trade, its network of trading posts and forts securing access to the sources of nutmeg, cloves, mace, and cinnamon. The competition from Portuguese and English companies, while never eliminated, had been contained to levels that allowed the VOC to maintain pricing power in European markets. The ships sailed and returned with regularity, their cargoes finding ready buyers at the Amsterdam auctions. The company's expenses, though substantial, remained manageable relative to the revenues generated. The balance between costs and income produced profits that could be distributed to shareholders, while still leaving funds for the company to reinvest in maintaining and expanding operations. The dividends during these decades were substantial. In a good year, the company might distribute 40 or even 50% of the original share value as dividends. If you had invested 3,000 guilders in 1602, purchasing one share, a 40% dividend would bring you 1,200 guilders that year. The following year might bring another generous distribution, perhaps 35%, adding another 1,050 guilders. Year after year the payments accumulated, each one recorded carefully in the shareholders' accounts, each one representing profit drawn from the sale of spices in Amsterdam, from the markup between what the company paid in Asia and what European merchants paid at auction. To understand what these returns meant, consider them in the context of other investments available to Dutch savers. A reasonably safe loan to a merchant or the city government might yield 5 or 6% per year. Land might generate rental income of 3 or 4% of its value annually. Government bonds, considered very secure, paid perhaps 4%. Against these alternatives, the VOC's dividends were extraordinary. Annual returns of 20 or 30 or even 40% dwarfed what could be earned through safer investments. The risk was certainly higher. Ships could be lost and profits could disappoint. But over a span of decades, the VOC's returns justified the risk many times over. These dividends were sometimes paid in cash, silver coins counted out and distributed to shareholders according to their holdings. But the company also sometimes paid dividends in kind. distributing spices directly to shareholders in proportion to their ownership. A shareholder might receive his dividend as a quantity of nutmeg or mace or pepper, which he could then sell privately or use for his own purposes. This practice conserved the company's cash reserves while still rewarding shareholders, and it gave investors direct exposure to the goods that generated the company's profits. Imagine opening a chest to find it filled with nutmeg, the scent overwhelming, the small nuts surprisingly heavy, each one worth a significant sum in Amsterdam's markets. The accumulated wealth from these dividends transformed the lives of many Dutch families. A merchant who had invested modestly in 1602 might find by 1640 that his original investment had returned several times over in dividends, while the shares themselves had increased substantially in value. He might use these returns to purchase a larger house, to commission portraits from fashionable painters, to endow a charitable foundation, or to expand his own business ventures. The VOC dividends became one of the engines of Dutch Golden Age prosperity, capital flowing from the company to shareholders to the broader economy, funding the artistic and cultural achievements for which the period is remembered. Some families held their VOC shares across generations, the ownership passing from fathers to sons, from husbands to widows, the shares becoming heirlooms as valuable as land or jewellery. These long-term holders viewed their shares as perpetual sources of income, not to be sold unless absolute necessity demanded. The shares represented a stake in an enterprise that seemed likely to endure indefinitely, that had proven its ability to generate profits decade after decade, that appeared to have established an unassailable competitive position. The dividends from these shares funded educations and dowries, paid for household expenses and charitable donations, provided the financial foundation for comfortable middle-class lives. Other investors traded more actively, buying when they believed shares were undervalued, selling when prices seemed high, trying to time the market to maximize returns. Some succeeded in this strategy, accumulating larger fortunes through clever trading than they could have earned, through simply holding shares for dividends. Others mistime their trades, selling before major dividend distributions or buying just before prices fell, learning expensive lessons about the difficulty of predicting market movements. But whether held long-term or traded actively, the shares served their purpose, providing a mechanism through which investors could participate in the VOC's profits. The company itself benefited from the high share prices that its profitability generated. Although the VOC didn't need to raise additional capital through selling new shares, the high market price of existing shares enhanced the company's prestige and credibility. Suppliers were more willing to extend credit to a company whose shares traded at high values. Employees could be paid partly in shares, which they could sell at attractive prices. The psychological effect of rising share prices created a virtuous cycle, reinforcing confidence in the company's prospects, making it easier to conduct business, attracting talented people who wanted to associate with obvious success. The auctions where the company sold its imported goods became major events in Amsterdam's commercial calendar. The warehouses would be opened, the goods displayed for inspection by potential buyers. Merchants would examine the quality, noting the colour and aroma of spices, the texture and weave of textiles, the craftsmanship of porcelain. On auction day, buyers gathered, bidding against each other, the prices rising as competition intensified. The auctioneers, experienced in reading the room and extracting maximum prices, managed the process skillfully, knowing when to push for higher bids and when to accept offers before interest waned. The company's strategy in these auctions balanced multiple considerations. Releasing too much of a particular spice at once would depress prices as supply exceeded immediate demand. Holding too much in inventory tied up capital and risked deterioration of the goods. The company needed to gauge European demand carefully to understand how much pepper or nutmeg the market could absorb at profitable prices, to time releases to coincide with periods of strong demand. This required sophisticated market intelligence, tracking consumption patterns, anticipating competitors' actions, understanding seasonal variations in demand. The company employed people whose entire job was to analyze these market conditions and recommend auction strategies to maximize revenue. The diversity of goods the VOC traded helped stabilize revenues. When spice prices were weak, textile sales might be strong. When Chinese porcelain flooded the market and prices fell, Japanese copper might be scarce and valuable. The company was not dependent on any single commodity, which reduced the risk that a collapse in one market would devastate overall profits. This diversification, built into the trading network through decades of experience and expansion, provided resilience that single commodity traders could never match. The company's control over supply gave it significant pricing power, though not absolute monopoly control. The VOC's forts in the Banda Islands and the Moluccas, those remote volcanic archipelagos where nutmeg and cloves grew, allowed the company to regulate production and prevent competitors from accessing the spices directly. The company made agreements with local rulers, sometimes backed by military force, that granted the VOC exclusive purchasing rights. In extreme cases, the company even destroyed spice trees to limit supply and maintain high prices, a practice that was economically rational from the shareholders' perspective, but devastating to the local populations who depended on spice cultivation for their livelihoods. This monopoly power was never perfect or permanent. Smugglers occasionally managed to obtain spices and sell them outside the VOC's control. Other European companies, particularly the English East India Company, competed in other regions and commodities. Indigenous traders continued to operate, their networks often more flexible and better informed about local conditions than the VOC's formal apparatus. But the VOC's market share was large enough that its decisions about supply significantly affected prices, and this influence translated directly into higher profits and larger dividends for shareholders. The relationship between the VOC's profitability and the Dutch economy, more broadly, was complex and consequential. The dividends paid to thousands of shareholders represented a massive transfer of wealth from Asian producers to Dutch investors. This transfer happened gradually, year after year, in amounts that individually might seem modest, but collectively transformed Dutch society. The capital flowing into Amsterdam and the other chamber cities funded construction projects, commissioned artworks, endowed charitable institutions, and provided the investment capital for other commercial ventures. The Dutch Golden Age in art, architecture, and culture was financed in part by the returns from Eastern trade. The paintings of Rembrandt and Vermeer made possible by the profits from pepper and nutmeg. But this wealth came with costs that were less visible to Dutch shareholders. The monopoly profits extracted from the spice trade meant that Asian producers received lower prices for their goods than free market competition might have produced. The military force used to maintain the VOC's trading privileges caused suffering and disruption in the regions where the company operated. The transformation of local economies to serve European demand for particular commodities created dependencies and vulnerabilities that would have lasting consequences. These costs were externalized, borne by people far from Amsterdam who had no voice in the company's decisions and received no share of its profits. The shareholders, comfortable in their canal houses in Amsterdam or Middelburg or Delft, were largely insulated from these realities. They saw the dividends arrive, read the reports of successful trading seasons, watched their share prices rise, and concluded that the company was well managed and the enterprise fundamentally sound. The violence and coercion that sometimes accompanied the spice trade were distant abstractions, occasionally mentioned in reports, but never experienced directly. The ethical questions about the legitimacy of monopoly profits and the use of force to secure commercial advantages were not entirely ignored. There were critics who raised such concerns, but they didn't prevent shareholders from accepting their dividends or the company from pursuing its strategies. The company's published financial reports during this period were limited and infrequent. Unlike modern corporations that release detailed quarterly reports, the VOC might go years without providing shareholders comprehensive financial information. The Heren 16 would occasionally issue statements about the company's condition, announce dividend payments, or describe major events affecting operations. But detailed accounting, breaking down revenues and expenses by region or commodity, was not provided. This opacity was partly practical. The complexity of consolidating information from across the company's far-flung operations made comprehensive reporting difficult, but it also suited the directors, who preferred to maintain control over information and decision-making without too much scrutiny from shareholders. Some shareholders complained about this lack of transparency, arguing that they had a right to understand how their capital was being employed and what return it was generating. Petitions were submitted, meetings were requested, demands were made for more regular and detailed financial reporting. The company resisted these demands, citing competitive concerns and practical difficulties. The disputes occasionally became heated, with frustrated shareholders accusing the directors of self-dealing and mismanagement, while the directors defended their stewardship and argued that shareholders should judge them by results, by the dividends paid and share prices achieved, rather than demanding access to operational details. Despite these tensions, the overall relationship between the company and its shareholders remained stable during the Golden Age. The dividends were too good, the share price appreciation too attractive for most shareholders to seriously challenge the existing arrangement. As long as the money kept flowing, as long as the VOC continued to deliver superior returns compared to alternative investments, shareholders were willing to tolerate limited transparency and concentrate power in the hands of the Heren 17. This acquiescence would have consequences later, when the company's fortunes began to decline and the accumulated problems of poor governance and inadequate oversight became more apparent. The employees of the company, from the governors general in Batavia to the sailors aboard the ships to the clerks maintaining the ledgers in Amsterdam, were essential to generating these profits but shared in them unequally. The directors and senior management received substantial compensation, both official salaries and opportunities for private enrichment. The sailors and soldiers, whose labour and risk made the trade possible, received wages that were modest though regular. The gap between what shareholders earned passively and what employees earned through active service was vast, a disparity that reflected the economic logic of capital returns, but also created resentments and incentives for corruption. Picture a shareholder in Amsterdam in 1650, a successful merchant who had inherited VOC shares from his father. His shares generate several thousand guilders annually in dividends, enough to maintain his household, employ servants, contribute to his church, and still have surplus for savings or investment. He lives comfortably, his financial security largely assured by these dividends, his main concern being that the profitable situation should continue. He reads occasional reports from the company, hears news from returning sailors, attends shareholder meetings when they occur, but his direct involvement is minimal. The shares generate income almost automatically, requiring no effort beyond the passive holding of ownership. Compare this to a VOC sailor making his third voyage to the Indies. His wage is perhaps 10 guilders per month, 120 guilders per year if he survives the full voyage, which might last 2 or 3 years. He faces danger from storms and disease, lives in cramped and unsanitary conditions, works long hours in difficult conditions. If he completes his voyage successfully and returns to Amsterdam, he might have accumulated a few hundred guilders in wages, enough to live on for a year or two if he's frugal. The disparity between his return for active service and the shareholders' return for passive ownership is striking. A reminder that in the VOC's economy, as in capitalism more broadly, capital earns more than labour. Yet the system functioned, and in functioning it created wealth on a scale that earlier generations could hardly have imagined. The VOC in its golden age was generating profits of several million guilders annually, distributing most of this to shareholders while retaining enough to maintain and expand operations. The compound effect of these returns, accumulated over decades, created substantial fortunes for families who had invested early and held their shares patiently. Some of Amsterdam's wealthiest families built their fortunes partly or entirely on VOC dividends, the steady flow of income from Eastern trade, providing the foundation for commercial and financial empires that would last for generations. The company's success also inspired imitators and competitors. Other European nations, watching Dutch prosperity and recognizing its connection to Eastern trade, established their own East India companies. The English company, chartered in 1600, grew steadily and would eventually surpass the VOC in size and reach. The French established their Compagnie des Indes Orientales in 1664. The Danes, Swedes and others formed similar ventures, each hoping to replicate the VOC's profitable model. This proliferation of competitors would eventually erode the VOC's dominant position, but during the Golden Age the Dutch company remained the largest and most profitable, the standard against which others measured themselves, and through it all the dividends continued, year after year, the tangible result of that vast apparatus of ships and forts and trading posts and employee networks. The money flowed from Asian markets to Amsterdam warehouses to auction houses to shareholders' accounts. A river of silver and gold generated by the patient work of commerce across vast distances. The shareholders deposited their dividend payments, calculated their returns, planned their futures based on the expectation that this profitable arrangement would persist. For several decades, that expectation was justified, and the VOC's golden age seemed like it might last forever, a perpetual machine for transforming Eastern goods into Dutch wealth, reliable as the seasons, as enduring as the company's charter promised it would be. The dividends that flowed so reliably to shareholders in Amsterdam represented only part of the company's financial story. Beneath the surface of profitability, hidden costs accumulated, inefficiencies multiplied, and structural problems gradually eroded the margins that made those generous distributions possible. The distance between Amsterdam and Batavia, which had always been a challenge, became an increasingly serious impediment as the company's operations grew more complex and the opportunities for misalignment between shareholders' interests and employees' actions multiplied accordingly. The fundamental problem was one that economists would later call the principal-agent problem, though the VOC's directors had no such formal term for what they were experiencing. The principals, the shareholders in whose interest the company supposedly operated, were scattered across the Netherlands, most of them passive investors who attended few meetings and exercised little direct oversight. The agents, the employees who actually conducted the company's business, were scattered even more widely, from the clerks in Amsterdam to the factors in remote Indonesian islands, each pursuing their own interests within the framework of their employment. Aligning these interests perfectly was impossible, and the gaps between what shareholders wanted and what employees did created losses that were difficult to detect and even harder to prevent. The geographic distance made the problem especially acute. A governor-general in Batavia, nominally serving the company and ultimately the shareholders, operated 6 months sailing time from Amsterdam. Any decision he made would not be reviewed by the Heren 17 for at least a year, probably longer, and by the time any correction or guidance arrived from Amsterdam, circumstances would have changed so completely that the original instructions were often irrelevant. This distance created effective autonomy. The Governor-General and other senior employees in Asia exercising power that was supposed to be delegated and supervised, but in practice was nearly absolute. The temptations facing VOC employees in Asia were substantial. The official salaries the company paid, while adequate, were modest relative to the opportunities for private enrichment that the position created. A factor responsible for purchasing spices could easily arrange to buy a small additional quantity for his own account, shipping it to Amsterdam in company vessels and selling it privately at the same high prices the company commanded. A warehouse supervisor could allow small quantities of inventory to disappear, recording spoilage or damage that never actually occurred. The missing goods diverted to private trade. A ship's captain could use cargo space intended for company goods to transport private merchandise, sharing the profits with complicit officers and merchants. These practices, known collectively as private trade or country trade when conducted between Asian ports, were technically forbidden by company regulations. Employees signed contracts pledging to conduct no private business, to devote themselves entirely to the VOC's interests, to ship no goods except on the company's account. But enforcement was nearly impossible. How could Amsterdam determine whether a particular shipment of pepper belonged to the company or to an individual employee? The paperwork could be falsified, the quantities adjusted, witnesses persuaded to corroborate false accounts. By the time any investigation could be conducted, the evidence was scattered across thousands of miles and multiple years, the trails cold and the witnesses often dead or scattered to other posts. The company adopted various strategies to combat this leakage. Periodic inspections were conducted, auditors sent from Amsterdam to examine the books in Batavia and the subordinate posts. Harsh penalties, including dismissal and prosecution, were prescribed for employees caught engaging in private trade. The regulations were repeatedly restated, each new set of instructions emphasizing that private trade was absolutely forbidden and violations would be severely punished. But the measures were only partially effective. The inspectors themselves were susceptible to corruption, accepting payments to overlook irregularities. The penalties, even when enforced, affected only the employees who were caught, while many others continued their private activities undetected. The regulations, however stern, couldn't change the fundamental incentive structure that made private trade attractive. Some historians estimate that private trade by VOC employees may have equaled or even exceeded the company's official trade in some periods and regions. If this is accurate, it represents an extraordinary drain on shareholder value, essentially a parallel company operating with the VOC's infrastructure, but for employees' private benefit rather than shareholders' profit. A ship sailing from Batavia to Amsterdam might carry an official cargo valued at, say, 100,000 guilders, generating profit for the company. But it might also carry an equal value in private goods, generating profit for the captain, officers, merchants, and factors who had arranged the shipments. The company bore the costs of building and operating the ship, but captured only half the revenue that ship's capacity generated. The accounting systems, sophisticated as they were for the era, couldn't fully capture this complexity. The ledgers in Batavia recorded official purchases and shipments, but they couldn't track the private transactions that happened in parallel. The inventory records showed what goods should be in the warehouses, but periodic physical counts often revealed shortages that were attributed to spoilage, theft, or accounting errors rather than systematic diversion to private trade. The financial statements sent to Amsterdam showed revenues and expenses, but those figures represented only the visible, official portion of the economic activity flowing through the VOC's network. The military costs represented another category of expense that gradually consumed more resources without generating proportional revenue. The company maintained forts and garrisons across Asia, from the Cape of Good Hope to Japan, each one requiring soldiers, weapons, ammunition, provisions, and periodic repair and reinforcement. A typical fort might garrison 100 to 200 soldiers, each receiving wages, rations, clothing, and medical care at company expense. The soldiers needed officers, who received higher pay. The forts needed cannon and gunpowder, walls and buildings, supplies that had to be shipped from Europe or procured locally at significant cost. These military establishments served commercial purposes, protecting trade routes, intimidating competitors, enforcing monopoly agreements with local rulers, and garrisoning the trading posts where commerce was conducted. But the relationship between military spending and commercial benefit was indirect and difficult to quantify. A fort might prevent competitors from entering a region, but how much additional profit did that exclusion generate? A garrison might deter attacks on company ships, but how many attacks would have occurred without the deterrent? The counterfactuals were unknowable, and the company's leadership had to make judgments about military spending based on incomplete information and uncertain projections. Over time, the military expenses grew as the company's territorial ambitions expanded and the competitive environment intensified. What had begun as a purely commercial enterprise gradually took on characteristics of a colonial power, controlling territories, governing populations, waging wars for strategic advantage. The costs of these activities, borne by the company and ultimately by shareholders through reduced profits, increased steadily. The company found itself funding conflicts that lasted years, maintaining military forces in regions where the commercial benefit was marginal, and bearing administrative costs for territories that generated little revenue. The governance structure, which had seemed adequate when the company was smaller and operations simpler, began to show strain under the weight of expansion and complexity. The Heeren 17 met infrequently, perhaps 2 or 3 times per year, each meeting lasting days or weeks, but still insufficient to review in detail the operations of an enterprise that now employed thousands of people across dozens of locations spanning 3 continents. The directors were merchants and financiers, skilled in commerce but not necessarily in managing large organizations, and they had their own businesses and interests demanding attention alongside their VOC responsibilities. The chamber system, which balanced regional interests and prevented any single city from dominating the company, also created coordination challenges and inefficiencies. The 6 chambers operated semi-independently, each managing its own investments, ships and warehouses. This decentralization had advantages, allowing chambers to respond quickly to local conditions and maintaining political balance among the Dutch cities. But it also meant that the VOC lacked the unified command structure that might have improved operational efficiency. Ships from different chambers might arrive in Asia simultaneously, competing with each other for cargoes despite all being part of the same company. Warehouses in different chamber cities might hold similar inventories, reducing the economies of scale that consolidation would have provided. The communication delays compounded every other problem. A decision made by the Heeren 26 in Amsterdam might take 6 months to reach Batavia, assuming the ship carrying the instructions didn't sink or get delayed. The Governor-General's response or questions might take another 6 months to return. A full exchange, question and answer required a year at minimum, often longer. By the time the dialogue concluded, the original issue might be resolved, superseded, or transformed beyond recognition. This delay made coherent long-term planning nearly impossible, and forced the leadership in Batavia to operate with great autonomy, making decisions that Amsterdam might not have approved but accepting after the fact because reversing them was impractical. The complexity of the company's operations also made comprehensive oversight difficult. The VOC traded in dozens of commodities across hundreds of ports and trading posts. Each commodity had its own supply chains, price dynamics, seasonal patterns, and competitive environment. Each trading post had its own relationships with local rulers and merchants, its own opportunities and risks, its own operational peculiarities. No individual, no matter how capable, could master all these details, and the Heeren 17th had to rely on reports and summaries that necessarily simplified and omitted vast amounts of information. The directors made decisions based on incomplete knowledge, sometimes with serious consequences that weren't apparent until much later. The company tried various reforms to address these problems. Salaries were occasionally increased, trying to reduce employees' incentives for private trade. Inspection regimes were strengthened, auditors given broader powers. The reporting requirements were made more detailed, demanding more frequent and comprehensive information from Asia. Penalties for corruption were increased. Public examples made of employees caught engaging in prohibited activities. But each reform encountered resistance and had unintended consequences. Higher salaries increased costs without necessarily reducing corruption. More inspections required more inspectors, who themselves needed monitoring. Detailed reports created administrative burdens that diverted time and attention from actual operations. Harsh penalties drove corruption underground rather than eliminating it. Picture a factor at a remote trading post in the Moluccas in the 1660s, responsible for purchasing cloves from local growers. He receives a modest salary, perhaps 200 guilders per year, adequate for basic needs, but not generous. He lives far from home, in a climate he finds oppressive, among people whose language and customs he barely understands. His contract with the Veuk runs for several years, and he cannot leave before it expires without forfeiting his pay. His work is tedious, recording transactions in ledgers, negotiating with local merchants who understand the market better than he does, managing a small staff of subordinates who resent his authority. The nearest VOC superior is days away by boat. The Amsterdam headquarters might as well be on another planet. An opportunity presents itself. A local merchant offers to sell him privately a small quantity of cloves at a favourable price. The factor could purchase these cloves with his own savings or borrowed money, ship them to Amsterdam in the next VOC vessel, and sell them there for several times what he paid. The profit from this single transaction might equal a year's salary. He knows the practice is forbidden, but he also knows that detection is unlikely, and that many of his colleagues engage in similar trade. The rationalization comes easily. The company pays poorly, the work is difficult, the risk he bears in this remote and dangerous place deserves compensation beyond his meagre salary. He makes the purchase. This decision, repeated by hundreds of employees across the company's operations, multiplied by years and decades, represented an enormous transfer of value from shareholders to employees. The company built the ships, maintained the forts, negotiated the monopoly agreements, bore the costs and risks of the enterprise, but employees captured a substantial portion of the returns. From the employees' perspective, this was fair compensation for dangerous service in difficult conditions. From the shareholders' perspective, it was theft, a violation of trust that reduced the dividends they should have received. Both perspectives had validity, and the tension between them was never fully resolved. The company's market dominance, which had been a source of profitability, also created complacency and inefficiency. With limited competition and monopoly control over key spices, the VOC didn't face the pressures that might have forced greater operational efficiency. Costs could be passed on to customers through higher prices. Inefficiencies could be tolerated because profits remained adequate. The discipline that competition imposes, the constant pressure to reduce costs and improve service, was largely absent. The company's employees, from the directors in Amsterdam to the factors in Indonesia, operated within a system that rewarded stability and risk aversion rather than innovation and efficiency. The accounting challenges grew more severe as the company expanded, consolidating financial information from dozens of locations, each using slightly different accounting conventions, recording transactions in different currencies, operating under different regulatory regimes, was extraordinarily difficult. The accountants in Amsterdam did their best, reconciling reports that arrived months or years after the transactions they described, converting between guilders and various Asian currencies, adjusting for known discrepancies and errors. But the resulting financial statements, while better than nothing, were approximations rather than precise records. No one, not even the most diligent accountant, could say with certainty what the company owned what it owed, or what it had earned in any given year. This uncertainty created opportunities for manipulation and made it difficult to assess the company's true financial condition. The directors could emphasize certain favorable aspects while downplaying problems. They could time the recognition of revenues or expenses to smooth reported profits, making the company appear more stable than it actually was. They could use accounting conventions that inflated asset values or understated liabilities. None of this was illegal or even necessarily improper by the standards of the time, but it meant that the financial reports shareholders received were as much constructed narratives as objective records, telling a story that the directors wanted to tell rather than revealing the complete and unvarnished truth. The inventory management presented particular challenges. Spices stored in Asian warehouses might spoil, be stolen, or be consumed by pests. But these losses might not be detected until months or years later, when someone physically counted the inventory and discovered shortages. The accounting records might show that 1,000 pounds of nutmeg were in storage, but when someone actually looked, only 700 pounds remained. What had happened to the missing 300 pounds? Spoilage, theft, or accounting error? The answer was often unknowable, and the company simply wrote off the shortage, adjusting the books to match reality and moving on. These write-offs, individually small, accumulated into substantial amounts across the company's many warehouses and trading posts. If each location lost 5 or 10% of its inventory annually to spoilage, theft, and errors, the aggregate loss across the entire network was significant. Some of these losses were genuinely unavoidable, the natural result of storing perishable goods in tropical climates without modern preservation technology. But some represented systematic theft or diversion, losses that could have been prevented with better controls but weren't, because the costs of implementing those controls exceeded the expected savings. The company continued to operate profitably despite all these hidden costs and inefficiencies. The margins on spices were large enough to absorb substantial leakage and still generate returns that satisfied shareholders. The monopoly profits were so substantial that even after employees took their private shares, after military costs consumed vast sums, after administrative expenses and losses, and all the other drains on profitability, enough remained to fund generous dividends and maintain the shareholders' confidence. But the company was less profitable than it appeared, and less profitable than it could have been with better governance and more effective control of its far-flung operations. The directors in Amsterdam understood these problems to varying degrees. Some were genuinely concerned and pushed for reforms. Others were more interested in maintaining the status quo, particularly if they or their associates benefited from the existing arrangements. The Heerenzichtsteam included members who had business relationships with VOC employees in Asia, who received gifts or considerations from those employees, who had financial interests that were served by looking the other way when problems arose. The governance structure that was supposed to protect shareholders' interests was itself compromised by conflicts of interest and the practical impossibility of effective oversight. Yet the company continued, the ships sailed, the dividends were paid, and for shareholders who measured success by returns rather than by operational perfection, the VOC remained a satisfactory investment. The hidden costs, while real and substantial, were hidden precisely because they didn't immediately threaten the company's ability to generate profits. The system was inefficient but functional, corrupt but still productive, plagued by problems but not yet failing. The gap between what the company achieved and what it might have achieved with better management grew wider. But as long as actual performance remained acceptable, few shareholders demanded the difficult reforms that might close that gap. And so the VOC operated, a vast commercial machine generating wealth for its shareholders while leaking value through 1,000 small breaches, each individually tolerable but collectively significant. The distance that made the enterprise possible also made its perfect management impossible, and everyone involved, from directors to factors to shareholders, made their accommodations with this reality. The company was profitable despite its flaws, successful despite its inefficiencies, enduring despite the hidden costs that accumulated quietly in the background, slowly eroding the foundations of that success, even as the dividends continued to arrive, regular as seasons, seemingly as permanent as the stars. The hidden costs and structural inefficiencies that had accumulated during the company's prosperous decades remained manageable as long as the underlying business remained strong. But no monopoly lasts forever, no competitive advantage endures indefinitely, and by the late 17th century, the conditions that had made the VOC so profitable were beginning to erode. The decline, when it came, was gradual rather than sudden, a slow diminishment of advantage that took decades to fully manifest. But the direction was clear to those who looked carefully at the trends beneath the surface. The competition from other European trading companies intensified steadily through the later 1600s and into the 1700s. The English East India Company, which had struggled to match the VOC's early dominance, grew stronger and more sophisticated with each passing decade. The English company had learned from the VOC's example, adopting similar organizational structures, raising permanent capital, establishing trading posts across Asia. But the English brought their own advantages, including closer relationships with local rulers in India, a different approach to colonial administration that in some regions proved more effective, and access to British manufacturing that provided trade goods Asian markets desired. The French entry into Asian trade added another competitor. The Compagnie des Indes Orientales, established in 1664 with strong government support, began operations with substantial capital and ambitious plans. The French company never achieved the scale or profitability of the VOC or English companies, but its presence in Asian markets meant one more buyer, competing for spices and other goods, one more seller in European markets affecting prices. The Dutch monopoly, which had never been absolute, became even less effective as multiple European companies established permanent presences in the regions where spices were produced. The nature of demand in European markets was also shifting. Spices, which had driven the VOC's early success, were becoming relatively less important as other commodities gained prominence. Coffee, which the company began importing in significant quantities in the late 1600s, found ready markets in Europe but generated lower profit margins than spices had. Tea, increasingly popular, particularly in England and the Netherlands, required different supply chains and trading relationships, and the VOC struggled to compete with English merchants who had better access to Chinese sources. Textiles from India, porcelain from China. These goods were valuable, but the competition for them was intense, and the profit margins narrower than the monopoly spice trade had provided. The company's own success in maintaining high spice prices created incentives for others to break the monopoly. Smugglers managed to obtain nutmeg and clove seedlings from the islands the VOC controlled, transplanting them to other regions beyond the company's reach. The French successfully established clove cultivation in Mauritius and other Indian Ocean islands. The British transplanted nutmeg to Penang and other Southeast Asian locations. These new sources of supply, developed over decades, gradually eroded the VOC's ability to control the spice trade through controlling the producing regions. The monopoly that had been enforced through forts and contracts and sometimes force was being undermined by botanical theft and agricultural expansion. The costs of maintaining the company's trading network continued to rise even as revenues came under pressure. The forts and garrisons that dotted the Asian coastline required constant maintenance and periodic reinforcement. The soldiers and administrators staffing these outposts needed to be paid, fed, clothed, and provided with medical care. The ships that connected this network were aging and needed replacement, but shipbuilding costs had risen. The company found itself spending more to generate the same or lower revenues, the classic squeeze that afflicts any enterprise whose competitive position deteriorates. The military conflicts in which the VOC became embroiled consumed increasingly large portions of the company's resources. The wars with local rulers in Indonesia, the ongoing competition with Portuguese and English forces, the need to defend trading posts against various threats, all of these demanded military expenditure that generated no direct revenue. The company had always had a military dimension, but in earlier periods the military spending could be justified as protecting profitable trade. As profits declined and military costs continued rising, the justification became weaker and the burden heavier. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, which began in 1780, was particularly devastating for the VOC. This conflict, part of the broader Revolutionary War involving Britain and various European powers supporting American independence, saw British naval forces attack Dutch shipping globally. VOC ships sailing between Asia and the Netherlands were vulnerable to British warships and privateers. Dozens of VOC vessels were captured or sunk, their cargoes lost, their crews killed or imprisoned. The company's trade was severely disrupted for several years, revenues fell sharply, and the losses were catastrophic. The financial impact was immediate and severe. Ships that were captured represented not only the loss of their cargoes, but also the loss of the vessels themselves, each one worth a substantial sum. The interruption of trade meant that goods that would normally have been imported and sold remained unpurchased in Asia, while European customers turned to other suppliers. When the war ended in 1784, the company faced the task of rebuilding its fleet, re-establishing its supply chains, and attempting to recover its market position, all while carrying the debt accumulated during the war years. The debt itself became an increasingly serious problem. The VOC had always borrowed to some extent, using short-term credit to smooth cash flows between the arrival of ships and the sale of their cargoes. But as profitability declined and expenses remained high, the company began borrowing more systematically to fund operations and pay dividends. This created a dangerous dynamic. The company was distributing profits to shareholders that it hadn't actually earned, making up the difference by borrowing. The dividends created an illusion of continued success, while the underlying financial position deteriorated. By the 1780s, the company's accumulated debt reached levels that made its survival doubtful. The exact amount was unclear, the accounting remained imperfect, but estimates suggested debts of 30 to 40 million guilders, an enormous sum compared to the company's original capital. The interest payments on this debt consumed revenues that might otherwise have funded operations or, if the company had been honest about its condition, should have resulted in no dividends at all. But the directors continued to pay dividends, unwilling to admit the extent of the problems, hoping that conditions would improve, that profitable trade would resume and allow the company to grow out of its difficulties. The share price, which had traded at multiples of the original value during the prosperous decades, began a long decline. Investors who had held shares expecting reliable dividend income found those dividends becoming irregular and smaller. Those who had hoped for capital appreciation watched the market value of their holdings erode. Some sold, accepting losses, trying to preserve what value remained. Others held on, hoping for recovery, unwilling to realize their losses by selling at depressed prices. The secondary market in VOC shares, which had been so vibrant during the company's peak, became thinner and less liquid as buyers grew scarce and sellers became desperate. The reports from Asia grew increasingly grim. The trading posts were struggling, facing intensified competition, dealing with local conflicts that disrupted commerce, operating with aging infrastructure that needed investment the company couldn't afford. The employees, sensing the company's weakness, became even more focused on private trade and self-enrichment, knowing that their employer might not survive and therefore maximizing their personal gains while opportunities remained. The factors and merchants in Asia, who had once been parts of a well-oiled commercial machine, were now operating almost independently, the central coordination and oversight from Batavia and Amsterdam having weakened to the point of ineffectiveness. The company attempted various reforms and restructurings. Commissions were appointed to investigate the problems and recommend solutions. Plans were developed to reduce expenses, sell unprofitable operations, focus on the most promising markets. Some employees were dismissed for corruption, though by this point the corruption was so widespread that selective enforcement could barely make a difference. The military establishments were reduced where possible, though the company's territorial commitments made wholesale withdrawal difficult. The reforms were well-intentioned but too limited, and too late to reverse the fundamental decline. The Dutch government, recognizing that the VOC's collapse would have serious economic and political consequences, began providing financial support. Loans were extended on favorable terms, helping the company meet its obligations and maintain operations. But these government loans simply added to the overall debt burden, postponing but not preventing the eventual reckoning. The company that had once been entirely private, financed by shareholder capital, and operating independently of government control, was becoming increasingly dependent on state support, losing its autonomy even as it lost its profitability. The dividends, which had been so generous during the Golden Age, became irregular and then stopped entirely. Shareholders who had counted on VOC income found themselves without it, their financial plans disrupted, their wealth diminished. Some families that had been comfortable or even wealthy, their prosperity built on VOC dividends accumulated over generations, found themselves in reduced circumstances. The shares that had been valuable assets, portions of estates carefully preserved and passed down through families, became nearly worthless pieces of paper, reminders of vanished wealth rather than sources of ongoing income. Picture an elderly shareholder in Amsterdam in the 1790s, a woman whose grandfather had purchased shares in 1610, whose father had held them through the prosperous middle decades, who had inherited them and expected to pass them to her children as valuable assets. She remembers the years when dividends arrived reliably, when the shares seemed as secure as land or government bonds, when VOC ownership was a mark of substantial wealth. Now the dividends have stopped, the share price has collapsed, and she understands that the company will not recover. The share she had treasured, had thought of as her financial foundation, have become worthless. The loss is not just financial but emotional. The betrayal of expectations held across 3 generations, the disappearance of what had seemed permanent and secure. The company limped through the 1790s, its operations continuing but barely, its debts growing, its prospects dim. The French Revolutionary Wars, which began in 1792, created new disruptions. French forces invaded the Netherlands in 1795, establishing the Batavian Republic, a client state aligned with revolutionary France. The new government reviewed the VOC's condition and concluded that the company was beyond saving as a private enterprise. The accumulated debts, the loss of competitive position, the disrupted trade networks, the demoralized workforce, all of it pointed toward dissolution. On December 31st, 1799, the VOC's charter expired. The company could have sought renewal, as it had in the past when charters came up for periodic review, but renewal was not granted and was not seriously pursued. Instead, the Batavian Republic nationalized the company's assets and assumed its debts. The ships, forts, trading posts, warehouses, inventories, everything the VOC had built over nearly 2 centuries became property of the Dutch state. The shareholders received nothing, their equity wiped out by the debts and losses. The company that had pioneered the joint stock structure, that had created the first modern stock market, that had generated enormous profits and transformed Dutch society, simply ceased to exist. The end was undramatic, a matter of administrative paperwork and government decree. There was no bankruptcy proceeding in the modern sense, no liquidation auction where assets were sold to satisfy creditors. The state simply took ownership, honoured some obligations and repudiated others, and that was that. The employees in Asia learned of the company's dissolution months later, when ships arrived carrying the news. Many had already left VOC service seeking opportunities elsewhere. Those who remained transitioned to employment with the Dutch colonial administration, which continued to operate the trading posts and forts that the VOC had established, now as explicit colonial possessions rather than commercial outposts. The legacy of accumulated decisions, of problems deferred and costs hidden, of competitive advantages lost and debts accumulated, had finally overwhelmed an institution that had once seemed impregnable. The distance that had made the enterprise possible had also made its effective management impossible. The monopoly that had generated extraordinary profits had created complacency and inefficiency. The structure that had allowed capital to remain permanent and operations to continue across generations had also created agency problems and governance failures. All of these factors, working slowly over decades, had transformed success into failure, prosperity into bankruptcy, permanence into dissolution. The VOC's fall was not a sudden collapse but a gradual exhaustion, the slow running down of an organization that had outlived its competitive advantages and failed to adapt to changed circumstances. The company had been innovative at its founding, creating structures and practices that would shape capitalism for centuries to come. But innovation at the beginning did not guarantee innovation throughout, and the company that had revolutionized commerce in 1602 had by 1799 become a burden rather than an engine of prosperity, a failing institution whose dissolution was inevitable and whose continuation served no one's interests. The shareholders who had lost everything might have found small consolation in knowing that their company had lasted nearly 200 years, had generated enormous wealth over most of that period, had pioneered practices that every modern corporation uses. But losses are felt personally and immediately, while historical significance is abstract and distant. The widow looking at her now worthless share certificates, the merchant whose inherited VOC shares had funded his comfortable life until they suddenly didn't, these people experienced the company's end not as a fascinating economic case study, but as a personal financial disaster, the destruction of wealth they had counted on, and the betrayal of expectations they had thought reasonable. And yet, despite the inglorious end, despite the losses and failures and ultimate dissolution, the VOC had demonstrated something important. It had proved that the joint stock corporate structure could work, that permanent capital and transferable shares could finance large-scale enterprise, that strangers could pool resources and trust in organizational structures rather than personal relationships. The company had shown both the potential and the perils of this form of organization. It had created immense wealth and pioneered financial innovations that remained central to modern capitalism. And it had also demonstrated the governance challenges, the agency problems, the difficulty of managing large organizations across vast distances, the tendency toward corruption and inefficiency when oversight is weak and incentives are misaligned. The VOC ended, but the practices it pioneered continued, refined and improved by later generations, who learned from both its successes and its failures. The corporation as an organizational form survived its first mega-scale manifestation, proving resilient and adaptable enough to remain relevant even as the specific company that pioneered it passed into history. Its charter expired, its shares worthless. Its once mighty commercial empire dissolved into memory and history books, leaving behind lessons that each generation of managers and investors and regulators would need to relearn, often at considerable cost, as the difficult work of organizing commerce and aligning interests continued across the centuries that followed. The dissolution of the VOC in 1799 marked an ending, but endings are also beginnings, and the company's influence extended far beyond its own operational lifetime. The structures it had pioneered, the practices it had established, the problems it had encountered, all of these became part of the inheritance that subsequent generations of merchants, investors, and regulators would work with, building on the foundation the VOC had laid, even as they tried to avoid the mistakes that had led to its downfall. The joint stock company structure that the VOC had perfected became the dominant form for organizing large-scale commercial enterprise. In the centuries following the VOC's dissolution, corporations spread across industries and continents, from railroads to manufacturing, to banking to technology. Each of these companies inherited the basic architecture the VOC had established. Permanent capital that didn't dissolve after each transaction, shares that could be bought and sold independent of the company's operations, separation between ownership and management, limited liability that protected shareholders from obligations beyond their investment. These features, revolutionary in 1602, became so standard by the 20th century that people rarely thought about them, accepting them as natural and obvious rather than recognizing them as specific innovations with particular histories. The stock exchanges that emerged in major financial centers around the world, traced their lineage directly to the informal market that had developed in Amsterdam for trading VOC shares. The New York Stock Exchange, established formally in 1792, though operating informally before that, the London Stock Exchange, the Paris Bourse, the Tokyo Stock Exchange, all of these institutions perform the same basic functions that Amsterdam merchants had pioneered 2 centuries earlier. They provided locations where buyers and sellers could meet, mechanisms for recording and settling transactions, rules and customs that facilitated trading, and the price discovery process that allowed the market's collective judgment about value to be expressed in continuously updated prices. The financial instruments that modern investors take for granted, options contracts that give the right to buy or sell at fixed prices, futures contracts that lock in prices for future delivery, short selling that allows betting against stocks, all of these can be traced to practices that emerged in the Amsterdam market during the VOC's lifetime. Isaac Lemaire and his associates had invented short selling, though the practice was later banned and then allowed again multiple times as regulators struggled with its benefits and dangers. The options trading that happened in Amsterdam coffee houses established patterns that would be formalized and expanded over subsequent centuries, eventually becoming the sophisticated derivatives markets that are now central to global finance. The corporate governance challenges that plagued the VOC remained central concerns for every large corporation that followed. How do you align the interests of managers with the interests of shareholders? How do you provide effective oversight when operations are complex and geographically dispersed? How do you prevent corruption and self-dealing by employees who have opportunities to enrich themselves at the company's expense? How do you ensure that boards of directors actually represent shareholders rather than entrenching their own power? These questions, which the Heeren 67 grappled with unsuccessfully, have never been perfectly solved, though each generation develops new mechanisms and regulations attempting to address them. Modern corporate law includes extensive provisions designed to protect shareholders and ensure proper governance. Requirements for regular financial disclosure, audited by independent accountants, aim to prevent the kind of opacity that allowed the VOC's directors to obscure the company's true condition. Rules about board composition, requiring independent directors who don't have business relationships with management, try to ensure that boards actually provide oversight rather than simply rubber-stamping management decisions. Regulations about insider trading, prohibiting trading on non-public information, attempt to level the playing field between those with privileged access to information and ordinary investors. All of these provisions address problems that the VOC experienced, lessons learned painfully through the company's failures. The concept of fiduciary duty, the legal obligation that directors and officers have to act in shareholders' interests rather than their own, developed partly in response to problems observed in early corporations like the VOC. The idea seems obvious now, that managers should serve the owner's interests, but establishing this as a legal requirement rather than merely an ethical expectation took time and developed through accumulated case law and legislative action. The VOC's history provided plenty of examples of what happened when this duty was breached or ignored, cautionary tales that helped establish the legal framework governing modern corporations. The geographic legacy of the VOC is visible in the modern world. Indonesia, which the company had used as its Asian headquarters and principal area of operations, remained a Dutch colony until the mid-20th century, gaining independence only in 1949. the city of Batavia, which the VOC had founded in 1619, became Jakarta, now one of the world's largest cities. Cape Town, which began as a VOC refreshment station for ships sailing to Asia, grew into a major city and eventually became part of South Africa. The Dutch cultural and linguistic influences in these regions, the legal systems that were established, the patterns of trade and economic organisation, all can be traced partly to the VOC's presence and activities over 2 centuries. The ethical reckoning with the VOC's legacy has been more complicated and contested. The company's pursuit of profit involved violence, exploitation, forced labour, and the destruction of existing economic and social systems in the regions where it operated. The monopoly profits that enriched Amsterdam shareholders came at enormous cost to Asian producers who received below-market prices for their goods, and to Asian labourers who worked under coercive conditions. The forts that protected VOC trade were instruments of imperial control, and the company's commercial activities were inseparable from the broader process of European colonisation that would shape global politics and economics for centuries. Modern historians debate how to assess these aspects of the VOC's history. Some emphasize the company's innovative contributions to capitalism and finance, arguing that these innovations, whatever their origin, have generated widespread prosperity, and that judging 17th century actors by 21st century ethical standards is anachronistic. Others argue that the company's record of exploitation and violence cannot be separated from its commercial innovations, that the profits were built on injustice, and that acknowledging this history is essential for understanding the full legacy of early capitalism. Both perspectives have merit, and the conversation continues, each generation reassessing the past through the lens of contemporary values and concerns. The museums in Amsterdam and other Dutch cities house artifacts from the VOC era, ship models and navigational instruments, share certificates and account books, maps and letters, the physical remnants of that vast commercial enterprise. Visitors can see the tools that sailors used, the porcelain that was traded, the coins that were minted, the ledgers where accountants recorded transactions in their careful handwriting. These objects, preserved in climate-controlled cases and studied by scholars, connect the present to that distant past, making tangible what otherwise might seem abstract. A VOC share certificate, faded but still legible, is not just a historical curiosity, but a direct ancestor of the stock certificates that still exist, the unbroken line connecting 1602 to the present day. The accounting practices that the VOC helped develop became foundations for modern financial accounting. The concept of a balance sheet, showing assets and liabilities at a point in time, the income statement showing revenues and expenses over a period, the distinction between capital and revenue, between operating and financing activities, all of these emerged from the practical needs of organizations like the VOC that required systematic ways to track complex operations over extended time periods. The double-entry bookkeeping that Italian merchants had pioneered was adapted and expanded to meet the VOC's needs, and those adaptations influenced how subsequent generations of accountants approached their work. The idea of portfolio diversification, spreading investments across multiple opportunities to reduce risk, was demonstrated practically by the VOC's structure. An investor who bought VOC shares wasn't betting on a single voyage or even a single commodity, but on the aggregate performance of dozens of ships, multiple trading posts, various products, the entire portfolio of the company's activities. This diversification reduced the variance of returns, making the investment more stable even if it didn't eliminate risk entirely. Modern portfolio theory, developed in the mid-20th century by economists like Harry Markowitz, formalized these insights mathematically, but the basic principle was already operating in 17th century Amsterdam. The regulatory responses to corporate failures, the laws and rules that governments develop to prevent or mitigate problems, often trace their origins to specific disasters or scandals. The VOC's eventual collapse, while not as sudden or dramatic as some later corporate failures, contributed to this accumulated body of regulatory knowledge. The recognition that companies could accumulate unsustainable debts while maintaining appearances of profitability, that management might pay dividends even when not earned to prevent panic, that without adequate disclosure and oversight, shareholders had no way to assess their investment's true condition. All of these lessons from the VOC's experience influenced later regulatory frameworks. The International Accounting Standards Board and similar bodies that work to harmonize accounting practices across countries are addressing problems that the VOC faced on a smaller scale. When a company operates across multiple jurisdictions, deals with multiple currencies, reports to stakeholders in different locations, how should financial information be consolidated and presented? The VOC's accountants struggled with these issues, trying to reconcile reports from Asian operations with European accounting conventions, converting between guilders and various Asian currencies, adjusting for time lags and missing information. Modern global corporations face similar challenges, though with better tools and more developed standards, and the solutions they develop continue the work that VOC accountants began. The concept of corporate social responsibility, the idea that companies should consider the broader impacts of their actions beyond just shareholder returns, can be seen partly as a response to the negative externalities that companies like the VOC created. When a company's pursuit of profit causes environmental damage, exploits workers, disrupts communities, or generates other social costs, should those costs be considered in assessing the company's performance? Should companies be legally required to account for these impacts? Should shareholders care about how profits are generated, not just how much is generated? These questions, now central to debates about corporate governance and stakeholder capitalism, have deep roots in the historical record of companies like the VOC, whose profit generation involved substantial harms to others. The phenomenon of the mega corporation itself, the very large company that dominates its industry and wields enormous economic and political power, was pioneered by the VOC. The company at its peak employed tens of thousands of people, operated across 3 continents, commanded military forces larger than those of many nations, and influenced the policies of governments, including its own. This concentration of power in a private entity created tensions and raised questions that remain relevant. When corporations become so large and powerful, are they still purely private actors, or do they take on quasi-governmental functions that should be subject to democratic oversight? How should societies balance the efficiencies and innovations that large corporations can generate against the risks of excessive concentration of power? The life cycle of competitive advantage, the observation that no company's dominance lasts forever because competitors eventually find ways to erode even the strongest positions, was illustrated clearly by the VOC's trajectory. The company's early advantages, its monopoly charter, its control of spice-producing regions, its superior organizational structure. All of these eroded over time as competitors imitated successful practices, found alternative sources of supply, and developed their own strengths. Modern business strategists study competitive dynamics extensively, analyzing how advantages can be sustained and what causes their eventual decay, and the VOC's history provides a lengthy case study in these dynamics. The question of corporate longevity, whether companies can be designed to last indefinitely, or whether organizational mortality is inevitable, remains unresolved. The VOC lasted nearly 200 years, longer than most modern corporations have existed. Some companies have lasted even longer. A handful of businesses can trace their operations back centuries. But most companies, even very successful ones, eventually fail or get acquired or transform beyond recognition. The factors that determine longevity, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, to maintain effective governance, to continue innovating while preserving core strengths, these remain subjects of study and debate, informed by historical examples like the VOC. The cultural impact of the VOC extended into literature, art, and popular imagination. Dutch Golden Age painters created works depicting the wealth that Eastern trade generated, the exotic goods displayed in still lifes, the comfortable interiors of merchant houses. The maps produced during this era, showing the routes to Asia and the locations of trading posts, were works of art as well as practical tools. The tales of voyages to distant lands, the encounters with unfamiliar cultures, the dangers of ocean travel, all of these entered into stories and songs, shaping how Dutch people and Europeans more broadly understood the wider world and their place in it. In financial markets today, when traders buy and sell shares, when investors construct portfolios, when companies go public and raise capital from thousands of shareholders, when stock prices fluctuate based on news and expectations, when options and derivatives are used to manage risk or speculate on price movements, all of this activity echoes practices that emerged in Amsterdam 4 centuries ago. The technology has changed. Electronic trading has replaced face-to-face negotiations. Computers have automated much of the process, but the fundamental mechanisms remain recognizable. The VOC's innovation of making capital permanent and ownership transferable created possibilities that continue to shape economic life in the 21st century. The questions that investors ask, evaluating whether a stock is worth buying, are the same questions Amsterdam merchants asked about VOC shares. What are the company's prospects? How capable is its management? What risks does it face? What competitive advantages does it possess? How do the expected returns compare to alternative investments? The analytical frameworks may be more sophisticated now, the information more abundant and timely, but the fundamental task of assessing value under uncertainty remains unchanged. Every investor deciding whether to buy shares is engaging in the same process that the widow in Amsterdam engaged in when she evaluated her VOC holdings, trying to understand what the future might bring and what that means for the value of paper claims on a distant enterprise. The story of the VOC is ultimately a story about human beings trying to organize themselves for economic purposes, creating structures and practices that would allow strangers to cooperate, capital to be pooled, risks to be shared, and profits to be distributed. The specific company failed, but the underlying innovation succeeded, proving robust enough to survive their original manifestation and spread globally. Every modern corporation, every stock exchange, every financial market carries forward the legacy of that first great experiment in corporate capitalism, learning from its successes and, perhaps more importantly, from its failures. The share certificates are now museum pieces, the ships long since rotted away, the forts mostly ruins, the company itself dissolved more than 2 centuries ago. But the influence persists, invisible but pervasive, woven into the fabric of modern economic life so thoroughly that we rarely notice it. When you open a brokerage account, when you purchase shares, when you receive dividends, when you check stock prices, you're participating in systems that the VOC helped create, following patterns established in Amsterdam in the 1600s, connected across time to those merchants and investors and clerks who were inventing, without quite realizing it, the economic structures that would shape the modern world. Perhaps that share certificate is still there, wherever you imagined it at the beginning, resting in its drawer or lying on a desk, the paper slightly yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. If you were to hold it now, you would understand it differently. Not just as a claim to ownership, not simply as a financial instrument, but as a connection to a long history of human effort and innovation, of merchants trying to organize commerce across impossible distances, of investors pooling capital and sharing risks, of systems being invented and refined and eventually taken for granted. We've followed the story from those first small companies, the voorcompagnieën that formed and dissolved with each voyage, through the revolutionary moment in 1602 when capital was made permanent and shares became transferable, through the decades of operations spanning continents and oceans, through the golden age of reliable profits and generous dividends, through the hidden costs and structural problems that accumulated quietly, through the long decline as competitive advantages eroded and debts mounted, to the dissolution in 1799 and the legacy that persists still. It's been a journey of nearly 4 centuries, from Amsterdam's canals to Jakarta's warehouses, from handwritten ledgers to modern electronic markets, from the first joint stock company to the thousands of corporations that exist today. But there is nothing you need to remember now. Not the dates, not the names, not the specific dividend percentages or share prices. Let the numbers blur, let the chronology dissolve. The details were never the point. What matters, if anything matters at all, is the quiet recognition that human beings have been organizing their economic lives through structures like this for a very long time, that the systems we participate in today have histories, that the familiar has roots in what was once unfamiliar and new. The ships have long since sailed their final voyages. The merchants who gathered in Amsterdam's exchange courtyard have been dust for centuries. The clerks who maintained those careful ledgers, the sailors who endured the long passages, the factors in remote trading posts, all of them are gone, their lives completed, their work done. The company they served and the shareholders who owned it passed into history, leaving behind only artifacts and records and the structures they pioneered, structures that outlasted them because others found those structures useful and adapted them for their own purposes. There's a kind of peace in recognizing that even the most powerful institutions are temporary, that everything built eventually declines, that permanence is always an illusion even when written into charters and constitutions. The VOC was designed to be permanent, its capital perpetual, its existence unlimited. And yet it ended, as all things end, not because of some single dramatic failure, but through the gradual accumulation of problems and the slow erosion of advantages, the patient work of time and change that no amount of careful planning can entirely resist. The legacy persists, but even legacies eventually fade. The practices the Vark pioneered will themselves be replaced someday by organizational forms and financial instruments we cannot yet imagine. Just as the VOC replaced the voorcompagnieën, just as future arrangements will replace what seems permanent to us now. The structures that shape our economic lives are human creations, and what humans create, other humans will eventually unmake or transform beyond recognition. There is no final form, no ultimate organization, only the continuing process of adaptation and change. So let it all drift away now. The spices and ships, the dividends and debts, the golden age and long decline, the innovations and failures, the whole elaborate story of that first megacorporation. None of it requires your attention any longer. The history has been told, the connections have been traced, the lessons have been noted, and now there is only the gentle letting go, the release of information that was never yours to hold permanently anyway. The workshops are quiet now, the counting houses are empty. The exchange courtyard stands silent, the voices of merchants no longer echoing between its columns. The ships rest at the bottom of distant oceans, their timbers long since dissolved, their cargoes scattered. The ledgers sit in archives, their pages brittle, their ink fading, read occasionally by scholars but mostly undisturbed, sleeping the sleep of documents whose moment has passed. The shares that once represented claims to ongoing income are now merely paper, historical curiosities, reminders that value is not inherent in objects, but exists only in the agreements we make, the meanings we assign, the systems we accept. And even these thoughts, these reflections on impermanence and legacy, these too can be released. There is no need to hold any of this, no need to carry forward into sleep any concerns about corporations or capital, about profits or losses, about the rise and fall of commercial empires. These are waking world concerns, and the waking world is far away now, its urgencies distant and diminishing, its claims on your attention weakening with each slow breath. Only rest remains, the deep rest that asks nothing, remembers nothing, connects to nothing but the simple fact of breathing, of existing peacefully in this moment without past or future, without stories or meanings, without even the awareness that there once were such things as ships and spices and shareholders waiting patiently for dividends that would arrive or not arrive according to circumstances beyond anyone's control. The VOC existed. Now it does not. We have existed in this conversation. Now that too is ending, dissolving like morning mist, leaving behind perhaps a trace, perhaps nothing at all, and either way it is perfectly acceptable, perfectly fine, no cause for concern or attention. So breathe slowly, let the images fade, release the names and dates, the concepts and connections, everything that was offered here, everything that might have lodged temporarily in your awareness. None of it needs to be retained. It was all just a gentle story, a long unwinding of historical thread, something to occupy the mind as the body settled into stillness, as consciousness prepared for its nightly release. The share certificate, wherever you imagined it, can stay where it is. You need not reach for it, need not examine it further, need not think about what it represents or meant or means. It is just paper and ink, atoms arranged temporarily in patterns that once signified ownership and value, but now signify only the passage of time and the transformation of all things. Drift now. Let go now. There is nothing more to understand, nothing more to learn, nothing more to stay awake for. The story is complete, the company has dissolved, the legacy has been noted, and all of it can fade into the peaceful dark where nothing needs to be remembered and nothing needs to matter, and there is only the quiet presence of rest. Only sleep remains. So rest now.